The swinging double doors of the trauma center at Atlanta General Hospital flew open as I pushed through them, letting the chaotic symphony of the emergency room wash over me. The harsh fluorescent lights beat down on the sterile linoleum floor, illuminating a scene of pure panic. I am Naomi, 35 years old, and the head of cardiothoracic surgery. I had not seen my parents in 7 long years. Not since the day they threw me out of their house and out of their lives like yesterday trash to protect my sister and her malicious lies. Now here they were. My mother Brenda was sobbing hysterically, practically collapsing into the chest of my father Calvin, right in the middle of the crowded triage area. When my mother finally lifted her head from my father's shoulder, her tear-streaked eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, I wondered if a mother seeing her flesh and blood in her darkest hour might feel a spark of connection. Instead, the grief on her face instantly twisted into pure, unadulterated disgust. "Who called you?" she screamed, her voice piercing through the beeping monitors and the rushing footsteps of the medical staff. "Get out of here right now. You lost the right to be in this family 7 years ago." I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply walked over to the wall-mounted dispenser, pumped antibacterial foam into my palms, and began to methodically sanitize my hands. If you have ever been completely thrown away by your own blood, only for them to end up entirely at your mercy, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you know what it feels like to build your own empire out of the ashes of a family betrayal. Because the look on my mother's face when she realized exactly who I was to this hospital is a story you absolutely need to hear. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood outside of Atlanta, we were the picture-perfect family to anyone looking from the outside. My parents hosted summer barbecues, drove luxury sedans, and smiled for every country club newsletter. But inside the walls of our 5-bedroom colonial house, a rigid hierarchy existed. My younger sister Jada was the undeniable golden child. She was pageant, beautiful, manipulative, and entirely allergic to accountability. I was the scapegoat, the dark cloud, the daughter who studied too much, spoke too bluntly, and refused to play the games that kept our family facade intact. 7 years ago, Jada committed an unforgivable betrayal that cost my parents their financial security. And instead of taking responsibility, she pointed the finger directly at me. Without a shred of proof, without a single conversation, and without letting me pack my belongings, my parents disowned me. They did not attend my medical school graduation. They did not celebrate my matching into a top-tier surgical residency. They did not even know that I was now married to a wonderful man. They chose their comfortable lie over my complicated truth. Tonight my pager had gone off loudly in the middle of a quiet dinner at home. Code Crimson in Trauma Bay 3. A 33-year-old female patient had been rushed in by ambulance following a severe high-speed collision on the interstate. The blunt force trauma to her chest had caused a massive internal hemorrhage. Her aorta, the main artery carrying blood away from her heart, was tearing. It is a catastrophic injury that requires immediate, highly specialized surgical intervention. The human body can only compensate for so long before the blood pressure plummets. The organs fail, and the lights go out permanently. I drove through the rainy Atlanta streets with my siren light flashing on the dashboard of my car, focused entirely on saving a life. I had no idea that the broken body lying on the trauma table fighting for a single breath was the sister who had ruined my life. As I stood in the emergency room wearing my tailored navy blue scrubs and a white coat draped over my arm, I watched my parents unravel. They had aged significantly since I last saw them. My father's hair had turned completely silver, and my mother's shoulders carried a heavy, exhausted slump. But her sharp tongue had not dulled one bit. She gripped my father's arm, her manicured nails digging into his jacket as she pointed a shaking finger at my face. "Calvin, tell her to leave," my mother demanded, her voice echoing off the hospital walls. "I will not have her standing here gloating while our baby girl is bleeding to death in there." She probably paid someone to find out we were here just to rub her success in our faces. My father puffed up his chest, trying to summon the old intimidating authority he used to hold over me when I was a terrified teenager. "Naomi, you need to turn around and walk out those doors," he commanded, stepping toward me with a hard glare. "This is a private family matter. You stopped being family the day you stole from us. Do not make me call hospital security to have you escorted off the premises. We are dealing with a tragedy, and we do not need your toxic presence making it worse." I looked at the man who used to teach me how to play chess on Sunday mornings and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the cold clinical detachment that made me the best surgeon in this state. I watched the charge nurse, a seasoned veteran named Patricia, rushing out of the trauma bay with a clipboard in her hands. Patricia's face was pale, and she was moving with the frantic urgency of a woman losing a patient. She spotted my parents blocking my path. "Excuse me," Patricia said, trying to maneuver around my father's broad shoulders. "Are you the parents of Jada, the blunt force trauma patient in Bay 3? "Yes," my mother cried out, instantly pivoting back to the nurse and grabbing Patricia's sleeve. "Please tell me she is going to be okay. You have to save her. And please get this woman out of our faces," my mother added, shooting a venomous glare in my direction. "We do not want her anywhere near our daughter. She is a horrible person, and we want her removed from the hospital right now." Patricia stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at my mother, hand gripping her scrub top, then looked at my father's furious face, and finally turned her gaze to me. A look of complete and utter confusion washed over the nurse's features. She blinked, adjusting her glasses, as if she had misheard the frantic woman standing in front of her. "Ma'am," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a serious, no-nonsense tone that commanded the entire room, "you need to step back and lower your voice immediately. The woman you are pointing at is Dr. Hayes. She is the head of cardiothoracic surgery for this entire hospital. She is the only doctor in this building right now who has the skill to fix your daughter's ruptured aorta. If you kick her out of this emergency room, your daughter will not survive the night." I did not wait to watch the color drain from my parents' faces. I turned my back on their stunned silence and pushed through the second set of double doors leading into the sterile corridor of the surgical wing. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, cutting off my mother's sudden gasp and the chaotic noise of the emergency room. Out here, it was just the steady hum of the ventilation system and the sharp clinical smell of antiseptic. I walked straight to the stainless steel scrub sinks outside operating room 4. My chief resident, Dr. Harrison, was already standing there pulling up the contrast CT scans on the glowing wall monitors. He looked tense. His eyes flicked to me as I stepped up to the sink and kicked the foot pedal to start the hot water. "Talk to me, Harrison," I said, pumping a heavy dose of chlorhexidine soap onto my scrub brush. "It is an absolute mess, Dr. Hayes," he said, pointing a pen at the digital screens. "Aortic transection just distal to the left subclavian artery. She has a massive mediastinal hematoma. The adventitia is barely holding the rupture together right now. Her systolic blood pressure is hanging by a thread at 70. If that thin layer of tissue gives way before we get her on the bypass machine, she will bleed out into her chest cavity in a matter of seconds." I began scrubbing my hands and forearms with aggressive precision. The stiff bristles of the brush scraped against my skin as I systematically cleaned every finger. I looked up at the digital monitors. Staring at the glowing three-dimensional reconstruction of my sister's chest cavity felt entirely surreal. There on the screen was Jada Hart, the exact same heart that had pumped cold, calculated deceit through her veins for her entire life. Now it was failing her. Looking at the jagged tear in the vascular wall on the monitor, a sudden memory flashed behind my eyes. It was sharp and vivid, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. 7 years ago, I was standing in the cramped kitchen of my medical school apartment, exhausted from a brutal 36-hour clinical rotation. My father had kicked my front door open so hard, the drywall splintered and cracked. My mother was right behind him, tightly clutching a thick stack of bank statements in her fist. Jada stood safely out in the hallway, peeking out from behind my mother's shoulder with a perfectly manufactured expression of terror on her beautiful face. $80,000, my father had roared, throwing the papers violently onto my cheap dining table. My entire retirement fund, Naomi. You stole my life savings just to pay off your medical school loans. I had stared at the scattered papers in absolute shock. The wire transfer authorizations had my signature on them, but they were clumsy, blatant forgeries. I had desperately tried to explain. I had begged them to look at the routing numbers. I had pleaded with them to check Jada bank accounts because she was the one who had just booked a lavish destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas with her fiancé Trey. I had frantically pointed out that Jada had a spare key to my apartment. She had planted the forged copies in my desk drawer and conveniently tipped off my parents to look there when the bank started asking questions. But my mother had simply stepped forward and slapped me across the face. It was a stinging, vicious crack that completely silenced my defense. She looked at me with pure hatred and told me I was a jealous, bitter liar who could not stand to see my younger sister happy. My father told me I was dead to them. They told me to never contact them again under any circumstances. They left me standing in that tiny kitchen with a burning cheek and a shattered reality. I had lost my entire family in a single afternoon, all because Jada wanted an oceanfront wedding and knew exactly how to play the victim to get away with it. Dr. Hayes, Harrison's voice snapped me violently back to the brightly lit scrub room. The warm water was still running over my soapy hands, splashing into the metal basin. "We need to move," he said, his voice tight with rising anxiety. "The hematoma on the scan is expanding." I dropped the scrub brush into the sink. I rinsed my arms, keeping my hands elevated above my elbows, watching the soap swirl down the drain. I was no longer the helpless medical student begging for her parents to believe her over the golden child. I was the apex predator in this hospital. I was the person who held the scalpel. "Have the perfusionist prime the pump immediately," I ordered, my voice echoing off the tile walls with absolute, unshakable authority. "We are doing a left posterolateral thoracotomy. Tell the blood bank I want 10 units of O-negative blood in the room right now, not on the way, in the room." Harrison nodded quickly and pushed backward through the swinging doors into the operating theater. I backed through the doors after him, holding my dripping hands up in the air. The scrub nurse Keller was waiting with a sterile blue towel. She handed it to me, and I dried my hands thoroughly before thrusting my arms into the sterile surgical gown she held open. I snapped my surgical gloves into place over the cuffs of the gown. The tight snap of the latex was the only sound in my head for a split second. The operating room was a hive of intense, organized chaos. 6 medical professionals moved rapidly around the surgical table where Jada lay completely unconscious. A thick plastic breathing tube was taped securely to her mouth, connected to a ventilator that was forcing air into her lungs. Her blonde hair was tucked away inside a blue surgical cap. Her chest was painted entirely orange with iodine disinfectant. Stripped of her designer clothes, her arrogant smirk, and her manipulative tears, she looked incredibly small and fragile. She was just a broken piece of anatomy waiting to be fixed. Suddenly, the rhythmic, steady beeping of the cardiac monitor accelerated into a frantic, shrill alarm. The numbers on the vital signs screen began dropping like stones in water, flashing bright red. "Pressure is tanking," shouted Dr. Jenkins, the lead anesthesiologist from the head of the surgical bed. "Systolic is down to 50, 45. Heart rate is spiking to 160. She is becoming highly unstable. The aorta is giving way," I said, stepping aggressively up to the surgical table and holding out my right hand without taking my eyes off my sister's chest. "Scalpel." Keller slapped the cool metal instrument firmly into my palm. "She is in ventricular fibrillation," Jenkins yelled, his gloved hands flying over the dials and buttons on the anesthesia machine. "We are losing her, Dr. Hayes. She is coding." I looked down at the chest of the woman who had happily destroyed my life and left me with nothing. I had a fraction of a second to make the incision. If I hesitated, my sister would die right here on this table, and my parents would have to bury their precious golden child. I tightened my grip on the handle, pressed the sharp blade into the iodine-stained skin, and pulled it downward. The heavy steel retractor cranked open, spreading the ribs apart and exposing the catastrophic damage inside my sister's chest. Dark crimson blood immediately flooded the surgical field, pooling faster than the suction tubes could clear it. "Harrison, get the suction deeper right now," I ordered, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the absolute chaos unfolding under the bright surgical lights. "We need to get her on cardiopulmonary bypass immediately, before the remaining adventitial tissue completely ruptures." The operating room moved in synchronized perfection. The perfusionist called out that the pump was primed and ready. I carefully guided the thick plastic cannulas into the right atrium of Jada Hart and connected the tubing. The heavy mechanical thumping of the bypass machine took over, filling the room with a steady, rhythmic hum as it drained the dark, unoxygenated blood away from her body, oxygenated it in the machine, and pumped it back into her femoral artery. The heart monitor flatlined exactly as it was supposed to. Jada Hart was now completely still, lying perfectly motionless in my gloved hands. Staring at the lifeless muscle and the massive jagged tear in her aorta, my mind drifted back to the sheer scale of her deception 7 years ago. The $80,000 she stole was not just a random amount of money. It was the exact cost of the extravagant destination wedding she and Trey had demanded. My father, Calvin, had worked grueling double shifts as a mid-level manager for 3 decades, meticulously saving every spare dollar for his retirement. But Jada never cared about his sacrifices. She and Trey wanted a private beachfront estate in Cabo San Lucas, a custom-imported designer bridal gown, massive ice sculptures, and a fully chartered flight for their 50-person bridal party. When my parents told her they could not afford to pay for such an absurdly lavish event, Jada simply decided to take the money anyway. She had always been a master of manipulation, but her execution of this crime was entirely calculated. She sneaked into my father's home office and accessed his personal computer, where he kept all his banking passwords saved on a sticky note under his keyboard. Over the course of 3 weeks, she initiated multiple wire transfers, funneling the retirement funds directly into an offshore vendor account for the resort in Mexico. But the bank fraud department eventually noticed the massive depletion of funds and flagged the account, calling my father to verify the transactions. Jada knew she was caught. She panicked. But instead of confessing and begging for forgiveness, she immediately engineered a plan to destroy my life to save her own. Knowing I was completely exhausted and rarely home due to my brutal 36-hour surgical rotations, she drove to my apartment and let herself in with the spare key I had given her for emergencies. She printed out fake transfer authorizations, typed up a fake business plan, claiming I was using the money to start a private medical practice, and forged my signature on every single page. She hid the documents in the bottom drawer of my desk. Then she went home and cried to my parents, claiming she had accidentally seen the paperwork at my apartment and was terrified I had done something illegal. My parents never even paused to question her story. They never asked why a medical student would wire money to a resort in Mexico. They simply believed the golden child. After my father kicked my door open and my mother slapped me across the face that day, they walked out and systematically erased my entire existence from their lives. The speed and cruelty of my excommunication was breathtaking. Within 24 hours, my father had canceled the auto insurance on my 10-year-old car. My mother terminated my health insurance and disconnected the cell phone plan I had been using since high school. They sent a lengthy, deeply dramatic email to every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family, claiming I was a degenerate thief who had drained their life savings to fund a secret lavish lifestyle. They warned the rest of the family to block my number and completely cut ties with me. Nobody called to ask for my side of the story. I was entirely alone. The timing of their betrayal was perhaps the most devastating part of all. It happened exactly 1 week before my medical school graduation. I was 28 years old, completely financially cut off and deeply traumatized by the sudden loss of my entire support system. On graduation day, I sat in a massive auditorium packed with thousands of people. Every other student was surrounded by proud parents carrying massive bouquets of flowers, holding balloons and snapping photographs. When my name was called over the loudspeaker, I walked across the stage in my heavy black robe and looked out into the sea of faces. There was no one cheering for me. There was no applause from my blood relatives. Just the polite, generic clapping of absolute strangers. I went back to my empty apartment that afternoon, sat on the floor with my diploma, and ate a cold sandwich in total silence. I had to take out a predatory high-interest emergency loan just to afford moving expenses to start my surgical residency in Atlanta. "Clamp," I said, holding out my hand. The surgical nurse slapped the heavy metal aortic cross clamp into my palm. I secured it firmly above the tear, shutting off the surgical area. I asked for the synthetic Dacron graft and the proline sutures. My hands moved with absolute mechanical precision. The fine curved needle pierced the synthetic material and then the fragile tissue of my sister aorta. Pulling the thread tight, I realized that every single stitch I placed was a direct testament to the discipline and resilience that had saved my own life. They tried to break me. They left me with nothing. But the fire they abandoned me in only forged me into the elite surgeon standing here today. I finished the continuous running stitch, sealing the graft perfectly in place. The repair was flawless. I gave the order to the perfusionist to slowly rewarm the blood and begin weaning her off the bypass machine. I removed the cross clamp, allowing the warm, oxygenated blood to rush back into the coronary arteries. We waited in tense silence for a few seconds. Then, with a sudden, powerful jolt, my sister heart began to beat again on its own. It was a strong, steady rhythm. I tied off the final knot on the suture, snipped the trailing end of the thread, and stepped back from the operating table. Jada was going to live. Now she was going to have to face me. I stripped off my surgical gown, letting the blood-soaked fabric drop into the biohazard bin. I peeled off my latex gloves, feeling the sweat on my palms hit the cool hospital air. I washed my hands for the third time tonight, watching the pink-tinted water swirl down the stainless steel drain. My sister was alive. The intense adrenaline that had carried me through the grueling operation was slowly beginning to fade, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I looked at my reflection in the locker room mirror. I was not the naive medical student they had discarded 7 years ago. I was a grown woman, an elite surgeon, and I was fully prepared for the venom I knew was waiting for me. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors leading into the intensive care family waiting area. The room was mostly empty at this hour, bathed in dim fluorescent light and the muted glow of a television broadcasting the local late-night news. My parents were sitting close together on a stiff vinyl sofa. My mother, Brenda, was aggressively twisting a shredded tissue in her hands, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Standing by the large window overlooking the parking lot was Trey. Trey was Jada's husband. He was the man whose extravagant beachfront wedding in Mexico was entirely funded by the $80,000 my sister had stolen from my father's retirement account. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and designer loafers, looking entirely out of place in a hospital at 2 a.m. He was aggressively tapping on his cell phone, his face illuminated by the screen, looking far more annoyed by the inconvenience of the night than devastated by his wife's near-fatal car crash. When the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, all three of their heads snapped in my direction. My father, Calvin, stood up immediately. He puffed out his chest, squaring his shoulders in that familiar, intimidating posture he used to control our household when I was a child. I did not shrink back. I walked steadily over to them, stopping a few feet away to maintain a strict professional boundary. "The surgical procedure is complete," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even and clinical. "She suffered a severe aortic transection from the blunt force impact of the collision. The arterial wall was tearing rapidly. I successfully repaired the rupture with a synthetic Dacron graft. She is currently stable and being transferred to the surgical intensive care unit for close observation. She is going to live." For any normal, healthy family, this would be the moment of overwhelming emotional relief. There would be tears of joy, desperate hugs, and profound gratitude that their daughter had survived a catastrophic injury. But this was my family. There was no joy, there was no gratitude. Instead, my father jaw tightened until the muscles leaped in his cheeks. He took a threatening step toward me, his eyes narrowing with deep aggressive suspicion. "You probably did this just to hold it over her head," he said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. I stared at him, letting his absurd accusation echo in the quiet room. "You probably pushed the other doctors out of the way just so you could play the hero," Calvin continued, pointing a finger at my chest. "You just want to make Jada feel like she owes you her life. You have always been incredibly selfish and vindictive, Naomi. You just could not let her have a moment of peace. You had to force your way into her tragedy just to make it all about you." "Your daughter was exactly 3 minutes away from bleeding to death internally on a trauma table," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper. "Her heart was failing. The only reason she still has a pulse and the only reason you are not currently planning a funeral is because I happen to be the head surgeon on call tonight." That is when Trey decided to step into the confrontation. He slipped his expensive phone into his jacket pocket and swaggered over, standing shoulder to shoulder with my father. He looked me up and down with a condescending, arrogant smirk that he had probably perfected in his corporate sales meetings to intimidate his subordinates. "We do not buy your savior act for 1 second," Trey said, puffing out his chest and crossing his arms. "I know exactly how much you hate my wife. You have been holding a pathetic grudge for 7 years because you are jealous of our marriage and our financial success. For all we know, you intentionally botched the procedure just to hurt her. I want to see her medical chart right now. I want a full independent review of every single thing you did to her while she was unconscious. How do we know you did not sabotage her recovery out of spite?" His sheer audacity was genuinely staggering. This man was demanding access to highly protected medical records while openly accusing the head of cardiothoracic surgery of intentional malpractice right in the middle of a hospital waiting room. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply shifted my posture, squared my shoulders, and looked at Trey with the absolute unyielding authority of a woman who ran a department of 50 elite medical professionals. "You are not getting anywhere near her medical chart." "Trey," I said, my words clipping through the air like sharp glass. "As an attending physician, I am legally bound by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Until Jada is completely conscious and legally signs a release of information, you are entitled to absolutely nothing but her basic vital status. Furthermore, my operating room is equipped with dual-camera surgical recording systems for strict liability purposes. Every single incision, every suture placement, every administration of anesthesia, and every vital sign fluctuation is fully documented, visually recorded, and time-stamped by a team of 6 independent medical professionals." I took one step closer to him, watching the false bravado begin to crack in his eyes. "If you ever openly accuse me of medical sabotage or question my professional ethics in this hospital again, I will not hesitate to have my personal legal counsel file a massive defamation lawsuit against you before the sun even comes up. Do you understand me?" Trey's condescending smirk instantly vanished. He blinked rapidly, his arrogant posture crumbling under the heavy weight of my direct legal threat. He opened his mouth to argue, but his jaw just worked silently, unable to find the words. He was completely used to bullying a submissive wife and manipulating my parents. He was entirely unprepared to confront an executive surgeon who held all the power and knew exactly how to use it. My father looked equally stunned. He stared at me slowly, realizing that the terrified 28-year-old girl he had thrown out of his house no longer existed. In her place stood a formidable woman they could not intimidate, manipulate, or verbally abuse into submission. "You have no right to speak to him that way," my mother chimed in from the couch, her voice trembling as she tried to salvage their shattered pride. "He is your brother-in-law. He is family. I am the attending surgical physician," I corrected her sharply, not even bothering to look in her direction. "And in this hospital, my authority is absolute. You can sit down and quietly wait for the intensive care nurses to call you back, or you can leave the premises." Those are your only two options." The three of them stood there completely trapped in their own bitter, hostile silence. They desperately wanted to scream at me to put me back in my place as the family scapegoat, but they knew I had them completely cornered. I turned to walk back to the surgical ward, perfectly content to leave them simmering in their toxic, helpless rage. But before I could take a single step away, a sudden polite throat-clearing sound echoed through the quiet waiting room, breaking the heavy tension. "Excuse me," a firm, professional voice said. We all turned to see a middle-aged woman standing near the entrance of the waiting area. She was wearing a neatly tailored gray blazer, with a laminated hospital security badge clipped to her lapel. She was holding a thick electronic tablet and a silver stylus pen. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Trey and my father. "Are you the immediate family members legally responsible for the patient?" "Jada, I believe it is her husband Trey?" she asked, glancing down at the glowing screen of her tablet. "Yes, I am her husband," Trey said quickly, puffing his chest back out and adjusting his jacket, eager to regain some sense of masculine importance. "What is this about? Can we finally go back and see her now?" "Not quite yet, sir," the woman said, offering a tight, highly practiced, sympathetic smile that hospital administrators exclusively reserve for delivering terrible news. "I am Susan, from the hospital financial billing department. We need to discuss the immediate financial liability and billing codes for tonight, emergency surgical procedures, and the upcoming intensive care stay." Trey waved his hand dismissively, rolling his eyes. "Just run my insurance card on file. We have premium platinum coverage. We are not worried about a hospital copay right now, just send us the bill in the mail." Susan stopped smiling. She tapped her silver pen against the side of her tablet. Her expression remained perfectly polite, but her eyes were sharp and unyielding. "Actually, sir, that is exactly why I was paged to come down here tonight," Susan said, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "Our administrative system shows that your premium health insurance policy was officially canceled for non-payment exactly 3 months ago. You are currently completely uninsured, and the estimated cost for tonight emergency open heart surgery and the subsequent intensive care recovery is currently sitting at over $250,000. Trey's face instantly lost all of its color, turning a sickly shade of gray. My father let out a sharp, audible gasp, stumbling backward slightly, as if he had been physically struck. My mother dropped her shredded tissue onto the floor. I stood quietly in the background, crossing my arms and watching as the massive financial trap they had spent years building for themselves finally began to spring shut. "There is some kind of mistake," Trey stammered, his voice cracking in a way that completely shattered his arrogant facade. "I pay that premium every single month on the first of the month. You need to check your system again." Susan did not blink. She simply tapped the screen of her tablet and turned it to face him. "There is no mistake, sir," she said calmly. "The policy was officially terminated due to 90 days of non-payment. We sent 3 separate certified letters to your home address on file. All 3 were signed for by someone at your residence. The coverage lapsed completely 3 months ago." Trey stared at the glowing screen. The harsh hospital lighting reflected off the sudden sheen of sweat on his forehead. He had spent the last 7 years parading around Atlanta in custom-tailored suits, driving a luxury sports car, and acting like he was the undisputed king of the world. He and Jada constantly posted pictures of their lavish vacations and expensive dinners on social media, building an illusion of massive wealth. Now his perfectly curated image was disintegrating right in front of my eyes. Calvin grabbed Trey by the shoulder, spinning the younger man around. "What does she mean the policy is canceled?" Calvin demanded, his voice rising with a sharp edge of panic. "Trey, you told me your sales firm just closed a massive quarter. You told me you were swimming in cash and looking to buy a boat." Trey swallowed hard, refusing to make eye contact with my father. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue," Calvin Trey mumbled, staring intensely at his expensive designer shoes. "The market took a bad turn recently. I had to prioritize some other investments to keep the business afloat. You prioritized your car payments over my daughter's health insurance? My mother shrieked, stepping forward. Her hands were shaking violently as she pointed at him. You let her walk around without coverage. Susan cleared her throat politely, drawing their attention back to the massive financial reality hanging over their heads. The initial surgical fee for Dr. Hayes' emergency intervention, the anesthesia team, the operating room time, and the synthetic Dacron graft brings the current total to roughly $140,000. Susan explained, reading clearly from her tablet. The remaining balance is the estimated cost for a standard 7-day stay in our surgical intensive care unit, which averages about $15,000 per day. Furthermore, without active insurance coverage, the hospital requires a financial guarantor to sign an assumption of liability form before the patient can be formally transferred out of acute recovery and into a standard room. My father's legs seemed to give out beneath him. He sank back down onto the stiff vinyl sofa, burying his face in his calloused hands. $250,000, he whispered, his voice muffled and completely broken. We do not have that kind of money. We do not have anything even close to that. My mother rushed to his side, sitting next to him and rubbing his back in a frantic motion. Calvin, we have to do something. She pleaded, her voice tight with desperation. We can take out a second mortgage on the house. We can pull from the retirement accounts. We have to save our baby girl. My father lifted his head and looked at my mother with eyes full of absolute despair and exhaustion. What retirement accounts, Brenda? He asked bitterly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Do you not remember? Our retirement was wiped out 7 years ago. It took everything we had left just to keep the house out of foreclosure. We have been living paycheck to paycheck ever since, scraping by just to pay the property taxes. We have absolutely nothing left to borrow against. The sheer irony of the situation was almost poetic. It was so thick you could choke on it. They were sitting here agonizing over the loss of the $80,000 that Jada had stolen from them to pay for a lavish wedding to a man who could not even afford to keep her health insurance active. They had ruined my life to protect a thief, and now that exact same thief was about to plunge them into inescapable financial ruin. I watched my father's shoulders shake as the reality of their situation crashed down on him. For 7 years he had held on to his righteous anger, blaming me for his financial struggles. He had convinced himself that I was the villain who had robbed him of his comfortable retirement. Now he was staring down the barrel of a $250,000 medical debt with absolutely no safety net, and the golden son-in-law was exposed as a complete fraud. Trey was pacing back and forth near the hospital window, muttering to himself and aggressively running his hands through his hair. He was not worried about Jada recovering from open heart surgery. He was not thankful that his wife was still breathing. He was terrified of the impending medical bankruptcy that was about to destroy his precious credit score and force him to liquidate whatever meager assets he had left to his name. So what happens if we cannot pay Calvin? Asked, looking up at Susan with a defeated, miserable expression. What happens to my daughter? Susan maintained her professional administrative composure, but her tone softened just a fraction. We will never deny life-saving medical care based on an inability to pay, sir, she assured him. However, without a signed financial guarantor, the debt will automatically attach to the patient and her legal spouse. It will go to aggressive medical collections and ultimately result in forced asset liquidation or severe bankruptcy. We do offer financial assistance and payment plans, but for a balance this large, the monthly installments would still be astronomical. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sob, pressing her face into Calvin's shoulder. We are going to lose everything, she cried. We are going to be living on the street, all because of that terrible, terrible mistake 7 years ago. She turned her head slowly and glared at me through her tears. Even now, completely crushed by the weight of Jada's terrible life choices and Trey's financial deception, my mother still found a way to project her anger onto me. She looked at me, standing calmly by the doors in my tailored surgical scrubs, with my unbothered expression and my obvious professional success. The room fell completely silent, except for the muffled sounds of my mother crying and the faint hum of the late-night television broadcast. The trap had closed perfectly. Trey was completely exposed as a broke, desperate fraud. My parents were financially destitute, still suffering from the theft they blamed entirely on me, and the hospital billing department was standing there waiting for someone to take responsibility for $250,000. I did not say a single word. I simply watched them drown in the immediate, devastating consequences of their own actions. But then my mother slowly stopped crying. She wiped her eyes and her expression shifted from absolute despair to a cold, desperate calculation. She looked at me and then she looked at Susan. The gears in her head were turning and a new terrible idea was forming in her mind. Panic was beginning to settle in and I knew exactly what was coming next. My mother stood up from the stiff vinyl sofa. She smoothed down the front of her wrinkled blouse and took a deep breath. She turned to Susan from the billing department and offered a tight, highly practiced smile. "Give us just a moment to discuss this as a family, Susan," she said, her voice completely devoid of the hysterical sobbing from just a minute ago. "We will have a financial guarantor sign the necessary forms shortly." Susan nodded politely, her expression remaining carefully neutral. She stepped out of the immediate waiting area and retreated down the hallway to give us privacy. The very second the hospital administrator was out of earshot, my mother turned her sights squarely on me. She marched across the room and deliberately planted herself in the doorway, blocking my exit into the main corridor. My father remained seated on the couch, watching her with a mixture of profound exhaustion and sudden, desperate hope. "Naomi, you are going to sign that paperwork," my mother said. It was not a request. It was a firm command delivered with the exact same authoritative tone she used to control me when I was a teenager. She looked me up and down, her eyes coldly evaluating my appearance. "You are the head of cardiothoracic surgery. You are wearing a Rolex watch on your wrist. You clearly make an exorbitant amount of money. You are going to take responsibility for this hospital bill right now." I stared at her. I could barely comprehend the sheer monumental audacity of her demand. "You want me to voluntarily take on $250,000 in medical debt for a sister who framed me, and parents who threw me away?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. My mother took another step forward, invading my personal space. "Do not play the victim with me," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into angry slits. "You owe us this money. You stole $80,000 from your father's retirement fund. You ruined our financial security and left us struggling for the past 7 years to keep a roof over our heads while you built this glamorous, wealthy life for yourself. Paying this hospital bill is the absolute least you can do to repay the massive debt you owe this family. Consider it basic restitution for your crimes against us." The twisted gymnastics of her logic were genuinely staggering. She had completely rewritten history in her mind to justify extorting me. She needed a villain to blame for her current miserable reality, and she had cast me in that role so long ago that she actually believed her own delusion. I looked directly into her eyes and let a cold, humorless smile touch my lips. "I did not steal a single dime from you." I said, my words clipping through the tense air like heavy stones. "I told you the truth 7 years ago, and you actively chose to believe a liar because it was easier than holding your golden child accountable. You made your choice. You cut me off without a penny. You sent dramatic emails to the entire extended family, branding me a criminal, and you forbade me from ever contacting you again. I am simply honoring the exact boundary that you aggressively established." I took a step forward, forcing my mother to lean back slightly against the heavy wooden door. "I am Jada, attending surgeon tonight, because I took a sacred medical oath to save lives," I continued. "I did my job perfectly and your daughter is alive because of my surgical skill. But I am not your personal bank account. I am not your emotional punching bag. I am not your scapegoat anymore. And I will absolutely not sign that piece of paper." My mother's face turned a mottled, ugly shade of red. The veins in her neck visibly bulged against her skin. Her desperate panic quickly mutated into aggressive, violent rage. She realized that her usual tactics of guilt and intimidation were bouncing right off my armor. If you do not walk over to that administrator and sign those financial papers right now, I am going to walk straight down to the main lobby of this hospital. My mother threatened, her voice rising to a shrill, piercing pitch. I am going to scream at the top of my lungs. I am going to tell every single patient, nurse, and doctor in this building that their precious head of surgery is a degenerate thief who robs her own parents and abandons her dying sister over a pile of money. I will call the local Atlanta news stations. I will humiliate you so completely that the hospital board of directors will have absolutely no choice but to fire you just to save their public relations. You are going to pay this bill, Naomi, or I will burn your entire career to the ground tonight. She stood there panting heavily, glaring at me with supreme, toxic confidence. She truly thought she held a winning hand. She thought the threat of public shame and professional ruin would force me to fold instantly, just like it used to when I was a terrified young girl living under her roof. She had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 7 years meticulously bulletproofing my life, my mind, and my career against her exact brand of manipulation. Let me be incredibly clear with you, Brenda, I replied, deliberately refusing to call her mom. My voice echoed coldly off the tile walls, carrying absolute authority. If you step foot in that lobby and cause a public disturbance, I will simply have the hospital security team arrest you for trespassing and disorderly conduct. I am an executive board member of this hospital. The security detail works directly under my administration. They will drag you out of here in handcuffs before you can even finish your first sentence. I will then have my corporate attorney file a massive defamation lawsuit and a permanent restraining order against you before breakfast. Do not ever test me again. My mother's jaw dropped open in absolute shock. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had no power here. Her threats were entirely empty against a woman who held every single card in the deck. She opened her mouth to scream, drawing a deep, ragged breath to unleash a massive, hysterical tantrum right there in the intensive care unit waiting area. But before she could make a single sound, Trey suddenly lunged forward from the corner of the room. He stepped aggressively between us and grabbed my mother by the shoulders, physically pushing her back toward the vinyl sofa. Brenda, shut up. Trey snapped, his voice frantic and completely stripped of its usual smooth, arrogant confidence. Just stop talking right now. You are making everything worse. My mother stumbled backward, looking at Trey in utter betrayal. But Trey was not paying attention to her anymore. He turned entirely to face me. His expensive designer suit looked suddenly rumpled. His eyes were wide with genuine terror, and a thin, visible layer of cold sweat coated his forehead. He looked absolutely terrified, like a man who was watching his entire life completely unravel. Naomi, please, Trey begged, holding up both of his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. Please do not call security. Please do not walk away. Just come out into the quiet hallway with me for 2 minutes. Just you and me. I need to tell you something in private, and I promise it will change everything. I stared at Trey. The sheer panic radiating from his body was palpable. My mother was still sputtering in indignation behind him, but Trey kept his eyes entirely locked on mine. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, waiting for the lever to be pulled. I did not owe this man a single second of my time. I had absolutely no obligation to listen to him beg after the way he had just spoken to me. But my clinical curiosity won out over my disgust. I wanted to see exactly how deep this financial grave was. Follow me, I said, turning on my heel and walking out into the main corridor without waiting to see if he obeyed. I heard his expensive leather shoes scrambling against the linoleum floor as he hurried after me. I led him down the quiet hospital hallway and pushed open the heavy wooden door to a small private family consultation room. It was a sterile, windowless space equipped with a round laminate table, a box of tissues, and 4 uncomfortable chairs. It was the exact type of room where doctors deliver the worst news of a person's life. I stood by the door, leaving it cracked open just an inch. I was not going to let him trap me in a closed room where he could try to physically intimidate me. "You have exactly 2 minutes, Trey," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "Make them count." The second we were out of sight of my parents, Trey's entire demeanor collapsed. The arrogant swagger, the condescending smirk, the aggressive posturing, it all completely evaporated. He began pacing the small room like a trapped animal, running his hands aggressively through his perfectly styled hair and pulling at the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. "You have to pay this hospital bill, Naomi," he blurted out, turning to face me with wide, desperate eyes. "You have to walk back out there and sign that financial guarantor form right now. If that $250,000 debt attaches to Jada, it automatically attaches to me. It will completely destroy my life." I watched him unravel with absolute clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. "Your life?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Your wife is lying in the intensive care unit with her chest cavity wired shut after an emergency aortic repair. And your primary concern is how her hospital bill is going to inconvenience your life." "It is not an inconvenience, Naomi. It is absolute financial devastation," Trey said, his voice rising in high-pitched panic. "You do not understand how my business works. I am in commercial real estate sales. My entire livelihood is built on my personal credit score and my financial liquidity. Everything I own is leveraged to the absolute limit. The house, the cars, the investment portfolios, they are all tied to massive lines of credit that require pristine financial standing. If a medical debt of this magnitude goes to collections and forces us into bankruptcy, the banks will immediately call in all my loans. They will liquidate my assets. I will lose my broker license. I will lose absolutely everything I have built." He stopped pacing and took a desperate step toward me, holding his hands together as if he were praying to a deity. He completely dropped the tough guy act and resorted to pure pathetic begging. "You are the only one who can fix this," he pleaded, his voice shaking. "You make incredible money. You are the executive head of surgery at a major hospital. You could pay this bill and barely even feel it in your bank account. You have to do this to save the family, Naomi. Think about your parents. If I go down financially, your parents are going to have to step in and support Jada. They will lose their house trying to keep her afloat. You have to be the bigger person here and save us from this nightmare." The absolute audacity of his plea was genuinely staggering. I looked at this grown man wearing a $3,000 suit, begging me to save him from his own irresponsible choices, while simultaneously trying to guilt-trip me using the same parents who had disowned me. "Save the family," I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh, unyielding whisper. "That is a fascinating concept, Trey. Because for the past 7 years, you and Jada have done absolutely nothing but flaunt your extreme wealth to anyone who would pay attention. You constantly post pictures from first-class flights to Dubai and Paris. You buy custom diamond jewelry. You drink $1,000 bottles of champagne at exclusive clubs. And unless my memory is completely mistaken, you just bought a brand new Porsche 911 Carrera last month." I saw the excessive photo shoot my mother proudly shared on her social media timeline, bragging about her incredibly successful son-in-law. I took a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to back up against the small round table. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed quietly, highlighting the thick layer of nervous sweat shining on his forehead. "Explain the basic math to me, Trey," I demanded, my tone sharp and cutting like a surgical blade. "Explain to me how a man who drives a $130,000 luxury sports car cannot afford to pay a basic monthly health insurance premium to protect his own wife. Explain to me why you actively chose to let her premium medical coverage lapse 3 months ago while you were driving around Atlanta pretending to be a multimillionaire." Trey opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. "If your business is so incredibly successful, why are you terrified of a single hospital bill?" I pushed harder, refusing to give him an inch of breathing room. "Where exactly did all of your money go, Trey? Because right now I am looking at a man who is completely broke and desperate." Trey stared at me as the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. He realized that none of his usual smooth sales tactics or manipulative charm would work on me. I was not my naive parents who blindly believed his corporate buzzwords and flashy lifestyle. I had completely cornered him, and I was systematically stripping away every single layer of his fake reality. He looked desperately at the cracked door and then back to me. His jaw trembled uncontrollably. He was cracking under the immense, suffocating pressure of his own lies. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the small room before he finally broke. Trey's legs gave out. He collapsed heavily into one of the stiff plastic chairs next to the small round table, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded almost like a sob. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were completely hollow. The arrogant salesman was gone, leaving behind nothing but a terrified coward. "I know you hate her," Trey said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you hate your parents for what they did to you, but you have to believe me when I tell you that I am a victim in all of this too. She lied to me, Naomi. She lied to everyone." I crossed my arms, keeping my back straight against the wall. "A victim," I repeated coldly. "Please enlighten me, Trey. How exactly is the man wearing a Rolex and driving a Porsche a victim of the woman lying in the intensive care unit?" He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. "Because I know the truth," he said. "I have known the truth for 7 years." The air in the small room seemed to instantly freeze. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my expression perfectly blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my shock. "What truth, Trey?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "About the money," he choked out. "About the $80,000. I know you did not steal it. I know Jada took it." I let his words hang in the dead silence of the consultation room. For 7 years, I had been branded a criminal by my own flesh and blood. For 7 years, I had built an entire life out of the rubble of that single catastrophic lie. And here was my sister husband, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital, casually admitting that he had known the reality this entire time. "Keep talking," I commanded. Trey swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. "It happened on our honeymoon," he began, his voice shaking. "We were in Cabo San Lucas. We had rented this massive private oceanfront villa. It was our 3rd night there. We had been drinking premium tequila all afternoon, sitting by the infinity pool. Jada was completely intoxicated. We started talking about the wedding, and I made a joke about how stressed your dad seemed when he was paying the final vendor invoices." Trey paused, pulling nervously at his shirt collar, as if it were suddenly choking him. And then Jada just started laughing. It was this dark, twisted laugh. She looked right at me and said my dad was stressed because he thought his brilliant medical student daughter was a criminal. I asked her what she meant, and right there, holding a $20 cocktail, she bragged about the whole thing. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in the pit of my stomach. My sister had not just destroyed my life out of panic. She had found it amusing. She told me exactly how she did it. Trey continued, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperate confession. "She told me how she slipped into your apartment when you were working a 36-hour shift at the hospital. She laughed about how easy it was to forge your signature on the wire transfer documents. She bragged about planting the papers in your desk drawer and then crying to your parents so they would go search your room. She said you were always so self-righteous and perfectly behaved, and she loved watching your parents finally turn on you." "And what did you do, Trey?" I asked, my tone lethal. "When your brand new wife confessed to committing felony fraud, stealing her father's life savings, and framing her sister to cover her tracks. What exactly did you do?" Trey looked up at me, his face twisting into an expression of pathetic defense. "What was I supposed to do, Naomi?" he pleaded. "We were already legally married. We were 3 days into our honeymoon. If I called the police or told your parents, I would have been dragged right into the middle of a massive criminal investigation. The wedding money was already spent. There was no way to get it back. If I blew the whistle, she would have gone to prison and I would have been publicly humiliated. I was trying to build my real estate business. I could not afford a scandal like that. So you stayed quiet, I said, summarizing his profound cowardice. You came back from Cabo. You sat at my parents' dining room table every single Thanksgiving for 7 years. You ate the food paid for by a man who was working double shifts in his 60s because his retirement fund was gone. You watched my mother cry over the terrible daughter who supposedly robbed them. And you never said a single word. I was trapped, Trey whined, raising his hands in a weak gesture of surrender. You do not know what it is like living with her. Jada is completely toxic. Whenever I tried to bring it up or suggested we slowly pay your dad back, she would threaten me. She said if I ever breathed a word to anyone, she would file for divorce and take half of everything I owned. She held it over my head to get whatever she wanted. She demanded the designer bags, the luxury cars, the expensive vacations. She bled me completely dry, Naomi. That is why the health insurance lapsed. She spent all our liquid cash on a custom closet renovation, and I had to start shuffling credit cards just to keep the lights on. I stared down at the pathetic creature sitting in front of me. The sheer magnitude of his parasitic nature was staggering. He was not a victim, he was a willing accomplice. He had happily enjoyed the fruits of my sister crime, as long as it benefited him. He drove the expensive cars and wore the tailored suits funded by my father, stolen retirement. He only cared about Jada's toxic behavior now, because the money had finally run out, and the consequences were directly threatening his own survival. You did not stay quiet because you were trapped. Trey, I said, my voice slicing through his pathetic excuses with surgical precision. You stayed quiet because you liked the lifestyle. You liked being the golden son-in-law. You liked watching my parents worship you while they struggled to pay their own mortgage. You are just as corrupt and disgusting as she is. Trey stood up desperately, closing the distance between us. You can hate me, he begged, his voice cracking. You can think whatever you want about me, but you have to pay this hospital bill. If you let this debt fall on us, I am ruined. Please, Naomi, I am begging you. Do it to punish her if you have to. Just do not let this destroy me. I looked at him, the gears turning rapidly in my mind. The perfect golden couple my parents had chosen over me was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on stolen money and mutual blackmail. And now, standing in this sterile hospital room, Trey was handing me the gasoline and the match. He had absolutely no idea who he was truly dealing with. He thought I was just a rich doctor he could manipulate with a sob story. He did not realize he had just given me the exact leverage I needed to burn their entire fake reality to the ground. Listen to me, Naomi, Trey said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that made my skin crawl. I am completely done with her. I have a meeting scheduled with a high-powered divorce attorney in Buckhead this Friday at 9 in the morning. I am filing the papers to end this marriage permanently. I did not react. I simply watched him, waiting for the catch. But in the state of Georgia, any debt incurred during the marriage is considered marital debt. He continued, his words rushing out in a frantic, desperate stream. If I am listed as her legal spouse when that hospital bill is finalized, I will be held equally responsible for the $250,000. It will completely drain my commercial accounts before the judge even signs the divorce decree. I will be forced to liquidate my real estate assets. I will be left with absolutely nothing. I slowly crossed my arms over my chest, sliding my right hand discreetly over my left wrist. With a subtle, practiced motion of my index finger, I pressed the digital crown on my Apple Watch. 2 quick taps on the glowing screen activated the voice memo application. A tiny vibration pulsed against my skin, confirming that the internal microphone was live and actively recording every single word echoing in this small consultation room. So, what exactly are you proposing, Trey? I asked, making sure my voice was loud and crystal clear for the audio file. He leaned closer, placing his hands flat on the laminate table. I am proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. You walk back out to that waiting room and you sign the financial guarantor forms. You take on the hospital debt. It will be an absolute drop in the bucket for a prominent surgeon like you. But for me, it is a total financial lifeline. If you sign those papers, the debt bypasses me completely. I file for divorce on Friday. I walk away completely clean, and my credit score remains untouched. I let out a slow, measured breath, feigning consideration. And what exactly do I get out of this arrangement? Why would I pay $250,000 just to make your life easier? Trey smiled, and it was the ugliest, most deceitful expression I had ever seen on a human face. You get your parents back, Naomi. Think about the big picture here. Once my divorce is finalized and my business assets are completely legally protected, I will sit down with your mom and dad. I will tell them the absolute truth about the $80,000. I will look them in the eye and tell them Jada confessed to the entire fraud on our honeymoon. I will be your star witness. They will realize you were telling the exact truth all along. Jada will be entirely exposed as a lying thief, and she will be saddled with nothing but a broken marriage and her own miserable, ruined life. We both win. The sheer sociopathy of his master plan was breathtaking. He was actively auctioning off the truth about my ruined life in exchange for a massive financial bailout. He was standing in a hospital where his wife was currently breathing through a mechanical ventilator with her chest wired shut, and he was meticulously plotting how to abandon her and leave her entirely destitute. He did not care about my relationship with my parents. He just knew exactly what emotional bait to dangle in front of the estranged scapegoat daughter. He assumed I was desperate for my parents' love and validation. He had no idea that I had stopped seeking their approval years ago. I needed to make absolutely sure the digital recording captured the full extent of his betrayal. Let me make sure I understand you perfectly, Trey, I said, keeping my tone perfectly even and conversational. You want me to pay $250,000 for my sister's medical care right now. In exchange, you will wait until your divorce is finalized on Friday to tell my parents that Jada committed felony fraud and framed me 7 years ago. You are deliberately using the truth about my stolen life as a bargaining chip to protect your real estate business and your personal wealth. It is just business, Naomi, he said, shrugging his shoulders as if we were negotiating a standard commercial lease agreement. You have the money, I have the truth. We make the trade, and we both walk away happy. Jada gets exactly what she deserves for bleeding me dry all these years. Do you really want to let her ruin my life the exact same way she ruined yours? We can team up and finally put her in her place. I looked at the pathetic man standing before me. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit, bought with stolen retirement money, driving a luxury sports car funded by my father's exhausted labor, and openly offering to sell me my own vindication. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the entire hospital. He thought he had perfectly manipulated the wealthy, bitter sister into financing his grand escape plan. I uncrossed my arms, letting my wrist drop casually to my side. The Apple Watch rested silently against my skin, holding a pristine digital audio file that was about to become the most destructive weapon in my arsenal. He had given me a full, uncoerced confession of his complicity in a major financial crime, his intent to abandon his wife, and his blatant attempt to extort me. You make a very compelling argument, Trey, I said, letting a perfectly calculated gentle smile spread across my face. It makes perfect logical sense to protect your assets before you file the divorce papers this Friday. Trey let out a massive, heavy sigh of profound relief. The tension instantly drained from his shoulders, and his arrogant, confident posture began to rapidly return. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed down the lapels of his jacket, and ran a hand through his hair. A smug, self-satisfied smirk crept onto his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully played both sisters, outsmarted my parents, and secured his luxurious financial future. I knew you were a smart, reasonable woman, Naomi Trey said, chuckling softly, as he turned and walked toward the door. I knew you would see the absolute logic in this arrangement. We will go out there and let your parents think you are doing this out of the goodness of your heart to protect the family image. It will be our little secret. Our little secret, I repeated, my smile widening just a fraction. Trey opened the heavy wooden door and stepped back out into the main hospital corridor, ready to play the role of the devoted, relieved husband for my waiting parents. I followed him out into the bright fluorescent light, feeling the cool metal of the watch against my wrist. He strutted down the hallway with a renewed, confident swagger. He had absolutely no idea that I had just secured the final, devastating nail for his coffin. 14 hours later, the harsh morning sunlight was streaming through the heavy blinds of the surgical intensive care unit. I had managed to catch exactly 3 hours of restless sleep in one of the on-call rooms before splashing cold water on my face and changing into a fresh set of navy blue scrubs. It was time for my morning rounds. I picked up my digital tablet from the nurse's station and walked down the quiet, highly monitored hallway toward room 4. Jada had been successfully extubated early that morning. The heavy plastic breathing tube had been removed from her throat, and she was now receiving oxygen through a standard nasal cannula. As I pushed open the heavy glass door, I immediately saw that the entire toxic family unit was completely reassembled. My father Calvin was standing by the window staring out at the Atlanta skyline. My mother Brenda was sitting in the plastic chair right next to the bed, holding Jada's hand and gently stroking her hair. And standing on the opposite side, playing the absolute perfect role of the devoted, terrified husband, was Trey. He was holding a small cup of ice chips, looking down at his wife with a perfectly manufactured expression of deep concern. I stepped into the room, the rubber soles of my shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum. The moment my mother saw me, her face hardened into a familiar mask of deep resentment. She leaned down and whispered something into Jada's ear. Jada slowly turned her head on the thin hospital pillow. She looked terrible. Her perfectly dyed blonde hair was matted with sweat and iodine. Her skin was a pale, sickly gray, and heavy, dark circles bruised the delicate skin under her eyes. The thick white bandages covering her chest cavity rose and fell with every shallow, painful breath she took. But the moment her eyes locked onto mine, I saw that the severe physical trauma had absolutely not dampened her venomous spirit. The golden child was awake, and she was just as vicious as the day she framed me. "Good morning, Jada," I said, keeping my voice entirely professional and devoid of any familial warmth. "I am going to check your surgical incision sites and review your morning lab results. Your cardiovascular output is currently stable, but we need to monitor your blood pressure closely." I stepped closer to the bed, pulling a penlight from my chest pocket. But before I could even check her pupillary response, Jada pulled her hand away from my mother and weakly swatted at my arm. "Get away from me," Jada croaked, her voice raspy and raw from the breathing tube. I paused, stepping back a few inches and calmly slipping the penlight back into my pocket. "I am your attending surgeon," I replied smoothly. "I need to complete my morning assessment to ensure the Dacron graft is holding properly." Jada glared at me, her eyes burning with a deep, irrational hatred. She was lying in a hospital bed entirely broken, relying on heavy intravenous painkillers just to exist, and yet she still looked at me like I was the dirt beneath her expensive designer shoes. "Do not act like you care about me," Jada whispered heavily, her breath hitching with the effort to speak. "I know exactly why you did this. You just wanted to swoop in and play the big hero in front of Mom and Dad. You wanted to make me look weak. Well, do not think saving my life makes us even, Naomi. You are still a thief. You still ruined our family." My mother nodded in aggressive agreement, glaring at me from her plastic chair. "She saved you because she felt guilty," Brenda chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic vindication. "She knows exactly what she took from us 7 years ago. This is just her pathetic way of trying to buy her way back into our good graces." I stood there looking at the two of them, marveling at the sheer psychological delusion required to maintain their twisted reality. My sister had stolen $80,000, framed me for a federal crime, and nearly bled to death in a car crash. Yet she was still desperately trying to gaslight me into believing I was the villain of her story. And my mother was sitting right beside her, eagerly feeding the delusion. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I simply typed a few notes into my digital tablet documenting her hostile mental state. "Your vitals are holding steady," I said, completely ignoring their ridiculous accusations. "We will begin weaning you off the heavy narcotics by tomorrow afternoon." Trey cleared his throat, stepping forward with his cup of ice chips. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, secretly thinking we were now partners in crime. He thought the audio file sitting on my Apple Watch was our mutual insurance policy rather than his imminent destruction. "Honey, you need to rest," Trey said softly to Jada, lightly touching her shoulder. "Dr. Hayes is just doing her job, and we actually have a very serious family matter we need to discuss with her regarding the financial situation." Jada's eyes darted toward Trey and then back to my mother. The anger in her face suddenly shifted into sharp panic. "What financial situation?" Jada demanded, her voice straining. My mother leaned in closer to the bed, her face twisting with dramatic sorrow. "Oh, sweetie, it is terrible," Brenda whispered loudly, ensuring I could hear every single word. "Trey let your premium health insurance lapse 3 months ago. You are entirely uninsured. The hospital billing department was down here last night. The surgery and the intensive care stay are going to cost over $250,000. We do not have the money to save you from bankruptcy because Naomi stole your father's retirement. But we are demanding that she pay the bill as restitution." Jada's eyes widened in absolute shock. She stared at Trey, who immediately looked down at the floor, playing the part of the ashamed husband. Jada knew exactly what this meant. She knew they were completely broke. She knew she had spent all of Trey's money on luxury handbags and custom closets. She was staring down the barrel of a massive medical debt that would completely destroy the fake wealthy lifestyle she had spent the last 7 years aggressively curating on social media. The raw panic on Jada's face was incredibly satisfying to watch. But the golden child was never one to accept defeat or take responsibility for her own financial disaster. I watched the gears turning rapidly in her head behind her pale, bruised eyes. She looked at my pristine white coat, my expensive watch, and my calm, unbothered demeanor. She realized that I was the only person in the room who held any actual power or wealth. Her initial shock quickly morphed into a cold, calculating glare. Her lips curled into a weak but deeply sinister smile. She was already formulating a plan. She was not going to beg me for money. She was going to try and take it by force, just like she always did. "You are going to pay every single penny of this hospital bill," Naomi, Jada whispered, her tone dropping the hysterical anger and adopting a deadly serious threat. "You are going to sign whatever financial papers they put in front of you. Because if you do not, I am going to make sure your perfect little medical career goes up in flames." I raised an eyebrow, tapping my stylus against the tablet. "Is that so?" I asked mildly. Jada weakly reached up and grabbed the edge of her hospital blanket, her knuckles turning white. "You forced your way into my operating room," she hissed. "I never consented to having you as my surgeon. You could have let another doctor do it, but you wanted control. If you do not pay this entire bill today, I will personally call the state medical board. I will tell them you intentionally operated on me against my will to cause me harm. I will sue this hospital for gross malpractice, and I will name you as the primary defendant." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The trap was set. Jada thought she had me cornered, completely unaware of the absolute hell I was about to unleash. I stared at Jada, listening to the rhythmic hiss of her oxygen cannula and the steady beeping of the cardiac monitor tracking the heart I had just repaired. The threat hung in the sterile air of the intensive care unit, heavy and suffocating. She was literally threatening to destroy my entire career, the career I had built, from absolute scratch after they abandoned me by falsely accusing me of medical sabotage. She was willing to perjure herself and drag me through a massive public scandal, all to avoid paying her own bills. My father, Calvin, took a deliberate step forward, moving to stand right beside Jada's bed. His face was set in a hard, grim line of determination. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a piece of white hospital stationery that he had folded into neat thirds. He smoothed it out with his large calloused hands and placed it on the rolling tray table, pushing it carefully toward me. "We do not want to ruin your life, Naomi," my father said, his voice adopting a sickeningly calm and rational tone, as if he were negotiating a simple business contract. "We really do not want to see you lose everything you have worked for. We just want what is fair. We drafted this up early this morning while you were sleeping. It is a legally binding assumption of financial liability. It simply states that you agree to take over the entire balance of Jada Medical Care, and in exchange, Jada agrees to sign a full medical waiver releasing you from any malpractice claims." I looked down at the piece of paper. The handwriting belonged to my mother. The cursive letters were sharp, aggressive, and deeply familiar. I read the words written in blue ink. "I, Naomi Hayes, hereby assume full financial responsibility for all medical costs incurred by my sister Jada. I agree to pay the hospital billing department directly and hold Jada and Trey harmless from any debt or legal obligation arising from this hospitalization." It was a crude, amateurish attempt at a legal document, but the intent behind it was absolute pure extortion. They were actually trying to blackmail the head of cardiothoracic surgery inside her own department. Jada shifted slightly against her pillows, grimacing in pain as her freshly sutured chest moved. But despite her physical agony, her eyes were bright with malicious triumph. "It is your word against mine, Naomi," she rasped, staring right at me with cold calculation. "A medical review board will look at our family history. They will see that we have not spoken in 7 years. They will hear Mom and Dad testify under oath that you have always harbored a deep jealous hatred for me. They will absolutely believe that you rushed into that operating room while I was unconscious to intentionally botch my surgery out of petty revenge. You will lose your medical license forever. Your entire reputation will be completely destroyed, and you will spend the rest of your life defending yourself in court." I looked at my mother, Brenda. She was sitting in the plastic chair with her arms crossed over her chest, nodding in firm, aggressive agreement with Jada's threat. She looked incredibly proud of her younger daughter. She saw absolutely nothing wrong with blackmailing the doctor, who had just spent 4 agonizing hours literally holding Jada, beating heart together. To Brenda, this was simply justice. Then I looked across the room at Trey. He was standing near the window, keeping his mouth entirely shut. He was playing the role of the helpless, terrified husband perfectly, but I knew exactly what was running through his cowardly mind. He was thrilled. He thought Jada's ruthless extortion scheme was going to save him. He thought he was going to get his massive medical debt paid off by his rich sister-in-law, allowing him to quietly file for divorce on Friday with his credit score completely intact. He was watching 2 sisters fight to the death and happily waiting to collect the spoils without getting his own hands dirty. I picked up the piece of paper from the tray table, holding it between my thumb and index finger. I looked at the crude handwriting again, marveling at the sheer psychological delusion of the people in this room. They truly believed they held all the power. "So let me make sure I understand the exact parameters of your offer," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and clinical. "You are explicitly threatening to file a fraudulent malpractice claim to the state medical board. You are threatening to purposefully destroy my professional livelihood, drag my name through the mud, and initiate a massive legal battle unless I agree to pay your $250,000 hospital debt." "It is not extortion, Naomi," my father interjected quickly, his face flushing a dull red as he tried to mentally justify his own corruption. "Do not use that word. It is a family settlement. We are giving you a very simple way out of a terrible situation. You owe us for what you took from my retirement account 7 years ago. We are just balancing the scales. Sign the paper, pay the bill, and we will all walk away quietly. You can go back to your wealthy life, and we can go back to ours. Nobody has to get hurt." I looked at my father. I saw the absolute desperation hiding just beneath his tough exterior. He was a broken man who had lost his life savings to a lying daughter, and now he was willing to become a criminal himself just to avoid facing the reality of his own colossal mistakes. He was willing to sacrifice his honest daughter all over again to protect the lie. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice to defend my surgical ethics or explain how easily my dual-camera operating room recordings would immediately disprove Jada's ridiculous claims. I did not tell them that a handwritten note extorting a medical professional was a felony offense that could send all of them to federal prison. Arguing with them would only validate their delusion that they held some kind of power over me. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to cry, or scream, or beg for mercy, just like I used to when I was a helpless teenager living under their roof. They wanted to see me break under their pressure. Instead, I slowly folded the piece of paper in half. Then I folded it in half again, pressing the creases sharply between my fingers. I calmly slid the folded paper into the front pocket of my white medical coat, making sure it was secure. I looked up and met Jada's eyes. She was smiling. It was a weak, exhausted smile, but it was dripping with absolute smug satisfaction. She thought my silence was submission. She thought I was putting the paper in my pocket so I could take it to my office and sign it in defeat. My father let out a long, heavy sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping as he thought the financial nightmare was finally over. My mother uncrossed her arms and sat back in her chair, looking entirely vindicated. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully outsmarted me and forced me into a corner. I did not say a single word. I simply turned on my heel, the rubber soles of my shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. I walked straight toward the heavy glass door of the intensive care room. I pushed it open and stepped out into the bright, busy hallway, leaving them sitting in their own toxic silence. I did not look back. I had my morning rounds to finish. I had a hospital to run. And I had a massive, meticulously designed trap to spring. Let them enjoy their imaginary victory for a few more days because discharge day was coming, and I was going to bring their entire world crashing down. It took another 6 hours to finish my surgical rounds and clear my administrative queue. I moved through the hospital corridors with methodical precision, compartmentalizing the sheer absurdity of what had just happened in intensive care room 4. When I finally handed my pager to the night shift attending surgeon and walked out through the automatic sliding doors of the main lobby, the warm evening air of Atlanta hit my face. It felt like stepping out of a suffocating pressure cooker. I walked across the reserved physician parking lot and unlocked my sleek black Aston Martin SUV. Sliding into the pristine leather driver's seat, I let out a long, slow breath. For 7 years, I had been the villain in their twisted family narrative. They had convinced themselves that I was living some miserable, guilt-ridden existence, entirely destroyed by their absence. They had absolutely no idea that their rejection was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. It forced me to strip away all the dead weight and build a kingdom of my own. I pulled out of the hospital parking lot and navigated onto the highway heading north toward the affluent suburbs of Milton. The chaotic noise of the city slowly faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of my engine and the soft jazz playing through the premium sound speakers. The further I drove from the hospital, the lighter my chest felt. 30 minutes later, I turned onto the private winding road leading to my neighborhood. I pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of my gated community, and they swung open smoothly, recognizing the transponder on my windshield. I drove up the long paved driveway, lined with perfectly manicured oak trees and lush landscaping. At the end of the driveway sat my home. It was a sprawling modern estate with massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a 4-car garage, and a beautifully illuminated stone facade. I had bought it entirely with my own money. There was no stolen retirement fund and no leveraged commercial credit, just the pure, undeniable reward of a decade of grueling medical dedication. I parked in the garage and walked through the interior door leading into the massive open-concept kitchen. The warm, inviting smell of roasted garlic and herbs immediately washed over me entirely, erasing the harsh, clinical scent of iodine and bleach that had been clinging to my skin all day. Standing by the marble kitchen island pouring a glass of deep red wine was my husband Devin. Devin was 36 years old, a brilliant corporate litigation attorney, and a managing partner at one of the most ruthless law firms in downtown Atlanta. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in dark tailored slacks and a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing his strong forearms. We had met 4 years ago during a complex medical malpractice deposition where I was called in as an expert surgical witness. He had cross-examined me with fierce intelligence, and I had systematically dismantled every single one of his legal traps with cold, medical logic. He asked me out to dinner the very next night. We had been inseparable ever since. He was my absolute rock. He knew every single detail about my toxic childhood, the stolen $80,000, and the sudden, brutal excommunication. He had held me during the rare moments when the grief of losing my parents temporarily overwhelmed me. But most importantly, my family had absolutely no idea he existed. They thought I was alone. They thought I was an isolated, bitter spinster. They had no idea I was married to a legal shark who destroyed corporate monopolies for a living. Devin looked up and smiled as I walked into the kitchen. His eyes were warm and grounding. "Long day, Dr. Hayes?" he asked, sliding the glass of red wine across the cool marble counter toward me. "You have no idea, counselor," I replied, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the wine. It was a complex, full-bodied Cabernet that instantly relaxed the tight muscles in my shoulders. Devin walked around the island and wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me into a firm, comforting embrace. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reliable beat of his heart. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, failing heart I had held in my hands the night before. This was my real family. This was the safe, peaceful sanctuary I had built for myself, far away from their toxic drama. I pulled back slightly and reached into the deep front pocket of my white medical coat. I pulled out the piece of folded hospital stationery and tossed it onto the pristine marble countertop. Devin raised an eyebrow, his sharp legal instincts immediately kicking in. He picked up the paper and carefully unfolded it. I watched his eyes scan the crude blue handwriting. I watched his jaw slowly tighten as he absorbed the sheer audacity of the document. He read my mother's handwriting outlining the fraudulent assumption of financial liability. He read Jade's blatant threat to release me from a fabricated medical malpractice claim in exchange for $250,000. He read the entire thing twice. When he finally looked up at me, his warm brown eyes had turned entirely cold and calculating. The loving, supportive husband had instantly stepped back, making room for the ruthless corporate litigator. "They actually wrote this down on paper," he asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "They explicitly documented a felony extortion attempt and physically handed it to you in front of witnesses. They really believe they are untouchable," I said, taking another sip of wine. "They think because they abused me into submission when I was a teenager that the exact same tactics will work on me now." Trey also pulled me into a private room. He confessed that he has known Jada stole the money for 7 years. He is planning to file for divorce this Friday, but he wants me to pay the hospital bill first so the debt does not attach to his commercial assets. He offered to tell my parents the truth about the theft only if I pay the $250,000. Devin stared at me. "This is textbook blackmail, Naomi," he stated flatly. "In the state of Georgia, attempting to extort a medical professional using threats of fraudulent board reports is a severe criminal offense. Did you get Trey on tape?" I tapped the face of my Apple Watch. "Crystal clear audio," I confirmed. "I have him admitting to his knowledge of the fraud, his plan to abandon his wife, and his attempt to extort me for financial gain." Devin slowly placed the extortion letter back onto the marble island, smoothing out the creases with the palm of his hand. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his handsome face. He looked at the piece of paper, and then he looked deeply into my eyes. He knew exactly how much pain these people had caused me. He knew exactly how long I had waited for the universe to finally balance the scales. "Is it time?" Devin asked, his voice low and incredibly steady. I looked around my beautiful, peaceful kitchen. I looked at the incredible man standing in front of me who loved me unconditionally. I thought about my mother sitting in that hospital chair glaring at me with unjustified hatred. I thought about my sister smiling smugly as she tried to blackmail me to save her own miserable lifestyle, and Trey thinking he could sell me the truth. I nodded once. Yes, I said. It is time. We are going to discharge her on Friday, and we are going to burn their entire fake reality to the ground. I left my empty wine glass on the kitchen island and walked down the wide hallway toward my home office. Devin followed closely behind me, his footsteps silent against the hardwood floor. My office was a reflection of everything I had built. It featured a massive mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with medical journals and framed surgical certifications that proved my unquestionable expertise. But the most valuable thing in this entire room was hidden out of plain sight. I walked over to the built-in shelving unit against the far wall and pushed aside a heavy medical textbook. Behind it sat a solid steel biometric wall safe. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing green scanner. The heavy locking mechanism clicked loudly, and I pulled the thick metal door open. Reaching inside, I pulled out a heavy manila folder and a small black USB drive. I walked back to the mahogany desk and dropped the folder onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. 6.5 years ago, I was a first-year surgical resident, completely broke and drowning in debt. I was surviving on cheap ramen noodles and sleeping on a terrible mattress on the floor of a tiny studio apartment. But I refused to let my sister destroy my name without finding out exactly how she did it. I spent months saving every single spare dollar I had, taking on extra hospital shifts and skipping meals until I could finally afford to hire an elite corporate private investigator. I paid him a small fortune to trace every single digital footprint Jada had left behind. When he finally handed me this folder, I had fully intended to mail it directly to my parents. But sitting in my empty apartment holding the absolute proof of my innocence, I realized something profoundly important. If my parents needed a private investigator to prove that I was not a thief, then they did not truly know me at all. They had actively chosen to believe a lie because it was easier. I realized that forcing them to see the truth would not heal my broken heart. So I put the folder in a safe and I moved on with my life. I kept it purely as an insurance policy in case Jada ever tried to come after my career. I never expected that I would be deploying it to completely dismantle her entire toxic marriage. Devin stepped up to the desk and opened the heavy folder. As a managing partner at a corporate litigation firm, his eyes naturally scanned the documents with ruthless precision. The first section of the file contained heavily detailed internet protocol logs. The private investigator had legally subpoenaed the digital records from my father's bank. The logs proved undeniably that the $80,000 wire transfer was not initiated from my apartment or my laptop. It was initiated from the exact IP address assigned to Jada's personal cell phone. And the cellular tower ping placed her physical location at a luxury nail salon in downtown Atlanta at the exact moment the money was drained from my father's account. Devin flipped to the next section, his expression turning completely icy. "This is absolutely airtight," he murmured, sliding a stack of high-resolution photographs across the mahogany desk. The photographs were printed directly from the bank interior security camera system. They showed Jada walking into the bank lobby wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying an expensive leather handbag. The timestamp on the photos perfectly matched the date the forged transfer documents were submitted. The final photograph in the sequence was a crystal-clear close-up of Jada, standing at the teller window physically sliding the forged paperwork across the counter. There was absolutely no room for interpretation. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a cold, calculated felony. But the most damning piece of evidence was in the final section of the file. The investigator had traced the exact flow of the stolen money. It showed the massive wire transfer going to the offshore vendor for the lavish Mexican resort. But it also showed a secondary line of fraudulent credit that Jada had opened using my father's remaining banking details. She had siphoned an additional $15,000 to cover the down payment on the exact same luxury Porsche that Trey was currently driving around Atlanta. Trey had stood in that hospital consultation room just a few hours ago and claimed he was an innocent victim who had only found out about the theft on their honeymoon. He claimed Jada had ruined him, but this financial trace proved he was directly benefiting from the stolen money long before they even got on the plane to Cabo San Lucas. He was entirely complicit in the theft from the very beginning. Devin picked up the small black USB drive, holding it between his fingers. "And this?" he asked, looking at me. "That is the digital backup of the bank security footage," I explained, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Plus the audio recording of Jada bragging to her friends about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate our parents." The investigator found a disgruntled former bridesmaid who was more than happy to hand over voicemails where Jada explicitly mocked my father for being gullible enough to believe I was the thief. Devin slowly set the USB drive down next to the thick stack of papers. He leaned over the desk, placing his hands flat on the polished wood. He looked at the mountain of undeniable, irrefutable evidence sitting in front of him. "This is not just enough to clear your name, Naomi," he said, his voice laced with dangerous legal confidence. "This is enough to send both your sister and your brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and banking conspiracy. If we hand this over to the authorities, their entire lives are legally over." I looked down at the documents. For 7 years, my parents had treated me like a criminal. They had missed my medical school graduation, my residency matching, and my wedding. They had allowed my sister to parade around like royalty, while I had to scrape and claw for every single ounce of success I had achieved. And today, they had actually attempted to extort me, while my sister threatened my medical license over a hospital bill they could not afford. "We are not going to the police," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "We are going to do something much worse." Devin raised an eyebrow, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. He loved watching me operate. He knew that when I decided to cut a tumor out, I did it with absolute surgical precision. "If I send them to prison, they get to play the victim," I explained, walking around the desk and standing next to him. "My mother will cry to the extended family about how the cruel justice system took her baby girl away. My father will visit them behind bars. They will still be united. They will still have their toxic little bond. I am not going to give them that satisfaction." I picked up the black USB drive and slipped it into the front pocket of Devin-tailored suit jacket. "I want you to draft a formal legal response to their ridiculous extortion letter," I instructed. "Make it look incredibly official. Put it in one of your firm, heavy manila envelopes. On Friday morning, when I officially clear Jada for medical discharge, we are going to walk into her recovery suite together. You are going to introduce yourself to my family as my personal legal counsel and my husband. And then you are going to hand them this entire file." Devin's eyes darkened with intense anticipation. He reached out and gently traced my jawline with his thumb. "We are going to let them completely destroy each other," he said softly, recognizing the absolute brilliance of the strategy. "Exactly," I replied. "I am going to trap them in a room, show my parents the undeniable proof that their golden child is a sociopathic thief, and then I am going to play the Apple Watch recording of Trey plotting to abandon her and steal whatever money is left. I am going to force them to look at the ugly, miserable reality they built. And then we are going to walk away and let the entire toxic family unit implode on itself." Devin closed the thick manila folder and picked it up. "Consider it done, Dr. Hayes," he said. "The trap is completely set." The rest of the evening was spent in the quiet sanctuary of my home office, transforming a pile of raw evidence into a weapon of absolute destruction. Devin sat at my massive mahogany desk, his fingers flying across the illuminated keyboard of his laptop. He was in his element. As a corporate litigator, he spent his days dismantling billion-dollar companies and finding the fatal flaws in massive legal contracts. Dismantling the fragile lies of my toxic family was practically a warm-up exercise for him. I stood by the window watching the printer hum as it spit out high-resolution copies of the bank security photographs. Every time a new page slid into the tray, I felt a heavy weight lifting off my chest. For 7 years I had carried the burden of their false accusations. I had let them paint me as the villain because I thought walking away in silence was the only way to protect my peace. But peace built on a foundation of unpunished lies is just a truce waiting to be broken. They had broken the truce the moment they tried to extort me in my own hospital. Devin hit the print command on his laptop and leaned back in his leather chair. "I just finished drafting the formal legal memorandum," he said, his voice sharp and focused. "It is a cease and desist order officially documenting their attempt to extort a licensed medical professional. It includes a full transcription of the handwritten note your mother drafted and a word-for-word transcript of the audio recording you captured on your watch today. I also included the penal codes for felony blackmail and insurance fraud, just to make sure they understand the exact amount of prison time they are playing with." I walked over to the desk and picked up the freshly printed pages. The legal jargon was dense, intimidating, and perfectly crafted. It left absolutely zero room for misinterpretation. But knowing my family, I knew that paperwork alone would not be enough. They were absolute masters of psychological manipulation and gaslighting. If I just handed them the documents, my mother would immediately start crying and claiming the photos were photoshopped. Jada would insist the IP address logs were hacked. They would try to spin the narrative right back onto me. "We cannot just give them the file, Devin," I said, sliding the bank photos into the heavy manila envelope. "We need to trap them in the reality of their own actions. We need a neutral third party in the room, someone with administrative authority who can bear witness to the evidence so my parents cannot twist the story later and claim I threatened them." Devin smiled, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration. "Way ahead of you, Dr. Hayes," he said, picking up his cell phone. "If we are going to do this right, we need to make sure they feel completely victorious right up until the exact second the floor drops out from under them." "Who is the billing administrator handling Jada uninsured account?" "Susan," I replied. "She is the senior financial coordinator for the surgical intensive care unit. She is the one who originally broke the news to them about the lapsed premium insurance." Devin unlocked his phone and tapped the screen. "Perfect," he said. "I'm going to call her right now. I will introduce myself as your personal financial representative. I will tell her that we have reached a family agreement regarding the $250,000 medical debt and that we need her present in Jada Recovery Suite at exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning to process the final guarantor paperwork." It was a brilliant maneuver. By requesting Susan's presence, we were ensuring that the hospital administration was fully involved, shielding me from any future claims of unprofessional conduct. More importantly, it would solidify my family absolute delusion. When Susan walked into that room on Friday morning, my parents and Jada would be entirely convinced that she was there to collect my signature and my money. They would be completely disarmed. I listened as Devin made the phone call, his voice dropping into the smooth, authoritative tone he used in federal courtrooms. Susan agreed immediately, expressing her relief that the massive financial liability was being resolved so quickly. The appointment was officially set. The next 3 days at the hospital felt like an extended psychological chess match. I continued my rounds with absolute clinical detachment, checking on Jada's surgical incisions and monitoring her cardiovascular output. Her physical recovery was progressing perfectly. The synthetic Dacron graft was holding strong and her vital signs had stabilized. But her attitude was more toxic than ever. Every time I walked into room 4, I was greeted by the suffocating smugness of my family. My mother would sit in her plastic chair, sipping mediocre hospital coffee and looking at me with a victorious smirk. She thought she had successfully broken my spirit. My father would stand by the door, puffing out his chest, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who believed his financial nightmare was about to be miraculously erased. And Jada was the worst of all. She treated the intensive care nurses like her personal servants, complaining about the food, the temperature of the room, and the noise in the hallways. Whenever I checked her chart, she would look up at me with dead, calculating eyes and whisper a single question. "Did you do the right thing yet?" I would simply look at her record her blood pressure on my digital tablet and reply, "Friday morning." Even Trey played his part perfectly. He hovered around the hospital room playing the deeply concerned husband whenever my parents were watching. But whenever he caught my eye in the hallway, he would offer a quick, conspiratorial wink. He sent me 2 text messages from an encrypted application reminding me of our secret deal. "Just sign the papers on Friday morning, and I will take care of the rest," he wrote. He was already packing his bags, mentally preparing to drop the divorce papers and run, leaving Jada drowning in the wreckage. I did not respond to his messages. I simply let the silence feed their massive egos. They were all so blinded by their own selfishness and greed that they could not see the massive shadow of the guillotine hanging directly over their heads. Thursday night slowly faded into Friday morning. The day of discharge had finally arrived. I woke up before the sun, feeling an incredible surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, pulling my dark hair back into a sleek, tight bun. I put on my tailored navy blue scrubs and slipped into my pristine white medical coat, making sure my hospital identification badge was perfectly straight. I did not look like a victim. I looked like the executive head of cardiothoracic surgery. I walked down the grand staircase of my home and found Devin waiting for me by the front door. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a solid burgundy tie. He held a sleek black leather briefcase in his right hand. Inside that briefcase was the thick manila envelope containing the absolute destruction of my family toxic empire. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of deep love and fierce legal readiness. "Are you ready to end this?" he asked. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air filling my lungs. For 7 years I had let them write the story of my life. Today I was taking the pen back. "I am ready," I said. "Let us go discharge my sister." I walked down the brightly lit corridor of the surgical recovery wing with my head held high and my posture perfectly straight. It was exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning. The hospital was buzzing with the usual organized chaos of morning rounds, but I felt an intense, hyper-focused calm settling over my entire body. Every step I took against the polished linoleum floor felt like a deliberate march toward freedom. For 7 long years I had carried the invisible heavy chains of my family false narrative. I had let them cast me as the jealous, bitter thief while they paraded around as the innocent victims. Today, I was finally breaking those chains and handing them back the exact miserable reality they had built for themselves. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door to Private Suite 4, I was greeted by a scene that was so completely absurd it almost made me laugh out loud. The entire toxic family unit was fully assembled and practically vibrating with impatient, arrogant energy. They had packed up Jada belongings into a matching set of expensive Louis Vuitton duffel bags that were currently stacked neatly by the door. I knew for a fact that those bags were purchased on high-interest credit cards that Trey could no longer afford to pay off. Despite having just undergone major open-heart surgery a few days ago, Jada was sitting up on the edge of the hospital bed, dressed in a luxurious blush-pink cashmere lounge set. She had clearly forced my mother to bring in her expensive makeup bag because her face was fully painted to mask the sickly pale hue of her recovering skin. She looked like she was preparing to board a private jet rather than being discharged into a massive financial nightmare. My mother, Brenda, was standing next to the bed wearing a pristine white linen suit and holding a heavy designer handbag tightly against her side. She looked at me with an expression of supreme haughty expectation. My father, Calvin, was standing near the window, dressed in a high-end golf polo and pressed slacks, looking like a wealthy patriarch who had simply been inconvenienced by a minor family squabble. And standing near the stack of luggage was Trey. He was wearing his signature custom-tailored suit, constantly checking his expensive watch and nervously tapping his foot against the floor. He was physically in the room, but mentally he was already sitting in his divorce attorney office waiting to pull the plug on his entire marriage. The moment I stepped fully into the room, the heavy door clicked shut behind me, and the air instantly turned freezing cold. There were no greetings. There were no expressions of gratitude for the fact that Jada was sitting up and breathing on her own thanks to my surgical intervention. There was absolutely nothing but raw, aggressive entitlement. Well, my father Calvin demanded, stepping away from the window and crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with the exact same intimidating glare he used to strike fear into me when I was a teenager. "We have been waiting here all morning, Naomi. Do you have the financial assumption forms signed and ready, or do I need to pull out my phone and call the state medical board right now?" He did not even bother to lower his voice. He was so incredibly confident in his position of power that he openly threatened a hospital executive in her own department. "Do not try to play any games with us today." Naomi, my mother, chimed in, taking a step forward and raising her chin aggressively. "Jada is completely exhausted from this dreadful hospital stay, and we are taking her home immediately. You know exactly what you need to do. Hand over the signed guarantor paperwork, so we can give it to the billing department and leave. If you try to back out of this now, Jada is going to file that malpractice claim before we even reach the parking garage." I stood there looking at them in their expensive clothes, surrounded by their luxury luggage, demanding that I pay $250,000 to save them from their own catastrophic life choices. The absolute sheer audacity of it was genuinely breathtaking. They had completely convinced themselves that I was still the weak, isolated girl they had thrown away 7 years ago. They thought I would blindly hand over my hard-earned wealth just to avoid a public scandal. I shifted my gaze to Trey. He was standing by the door, trying his absolute hardest to blend into the background. When my parents were not looking directly at him, he gave me a very subtle, urgent nod. It was the frantic, conspiratorial gesture of a desperate coward. He was silently begging me to hand over the paperwork so he could escape the marital debt and rush off to file his divorce papers. He truly believed we were secret partners in this grand deception. Finally, I looked at Jada. She was holding a plastic cup of water, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the side. She offered me a slow, triumphant smirk that was completely devoid of any human empathy. She had stolen from our father, framed me for the crime, lived a life of absolute luxury on the proceeds, and now she thought she had successfully blackmailed me into paying for the medical consequences. "Just give them the paper, Naomi." Jada rasped, her voice still weak but dripping with venomous condescension. "You owe me this. You owe our family this. Just sign your name, pay the bill, and you can go right back to pretending we do not exist. We all know you can afford it. Stop dragging this out and just do what you are told." I let her words hang in the sterile air of the hospital room for a long moment. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in defense. I simply reached into the deep front pocket of my pristine white medical coat. My father let out a loud, heavy sigh of relief, uncrossing his arms. My mother smiled a cold, victorious smile. Trey's shoulders visibly dropped as he prepared to grab the Louis Vuitton bags and make his grand escape. They all thought they had won, but I did not pull out the folded piece of handwritten extortion paper. I kept my hand resting casually inside my pocket, and I offered them a slow, perfectly calm smile that made the smug expression on Jada's face completely falter. "I understand that you are all very eager to finalize the financial arrangements for this hospital stay," I said, my voice carrying the absolute unyielding authority of an executive surgeon. "However, I do not sign legally binding financial contracts or address threats of medical malpractice without proper professional consultation." My father's face immediately darkened with fresh anger. "What the hell are you talking about, Naomi?" he snapped, taking a heavy, aggressive step toward me. "We had an agreement. You are not bringing any hospital lawyers into this." "Oh, I am not bringing a hospital lawyer into this, Calvin," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "This is a private family matter, just like you said. But since you decided to introduce written extortion and threats of federal insurance fraud into the conversation, I felt it was only appropriate to protect myself." I took 2 deliberate steps backward, reaching out and grabbing the heavy silver handle of the suite door. I looked directly into my mother's shocked eyes, and then shifted my gaze to Trey's suddenly terrified face. Actually, I brought my personal legal counsel to review the paperwork with you, I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the rising panic in the room. I pressed down on the handle and pulled the heavy wooden door wide open, stepping aside to clear the entrance. I stepped back and Devin walked into the room. He looked absolutely lethal. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that perfectly accentuated his broad shoulders and commanding presence. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase in his right hand. Right behind him was Susan from the billing department, holding her electronic tablet and wearing her formal administrative badge. My father, Calvin, looked completely bewildered. He stared at Devin, trying to figure out who this towering, imposing man was. My mother, Brenda, clutched her designer bag tighter, looking deeply offended by the sudden intrusion. Trey took one single look at Devin, and his entire body froze. Trey worked in commercial real estate, and he instantly recognized the aura of a man who destroyed people in boardrooms for a living. "Who is this man?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. "I thought we agreed to keep this matter strictly within the family, Naomi. We do not need hospital administrators or random lawyers getting involved in our private business." I smiled, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of Devin standing right beside me. "This is entirely within the family, Brenda," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I would like to officially introduce you to Devin. He is a managing partner at one of the top corporate litigation firms in downtown Atlanta. He is also my husband. We have been happily married for 4 years." The collective gasp in the room was incredibly satisfying to hear. My parents stared at me with their mouths actually hanging open in absolute shock. They had spent 7 entire years completely convincing themselves that I was a lonely, miserable outcast. They had built a narrative where I was suffering every single day without their love and approval. Finding out that I was married to a powerful, wealthy attorney completely shattered their carefully constructed delusion. Jada gripped her hospital blanket, her eyes darting between me and Devin in raw disbelief. Trey looked like he was about to physically be sick. He realized instantly that his grand manipulation plan was completely falling apart. Devin did not offer to shake their hands. He did not offer a polite smile or a friendly greeting. He simply walked past my stunned father and set his heavy black briefcase directly onto the rolling tray table at the foot of Jada's bed. He popped the dual metal latches with a loud, decisive click. He reached inside and pulled out the thick manila folder we had prepared the night before. Susan stood quietly by the closed door, acting as the perfect neutral administrative witness to everything that was about to unfold. Calvin tried to forcefully regain some sense of his patriarchal authority. He puffed out his chest and took a step toward the tray table. "I do not care who this man is or who he works for," Calvin stated, his voice trembling slightly despite his aggressive posture. "We are here to finalize the hospital billing paperwork so we can take our daughter home. We are not playing these legal intimidation games." Devin looked at my father with eyes as cold and unforgiving as ice. He did not back down an inch. He picked up the heavy folder and held it out directly to Calvin. "We are not here about the hospital bill," Devin said, his voice vibrating with absolute legal authority that commanded the entire room. "We are here about the felony fraud committed against my wife." Calvin looked down at the thick folder. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached out and took it from Devin. He opened the heavy cover and stared at the first page. It was the formal legal cease and desist order Devin had drafted. But before my father could even begin to process the dense legal terminology, Devin reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver iPad. He propped the device up on the hospital tray table right in front of Jada and my parents. "I want you to pay very close attention to this screen," Devin instructed the room, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "This is interior high-definition security footage legally subpoenaed from the main downtown branch of your bank. It is dated exactly 7 years ago on the precise afternoon your retirement funds were drained. My mother let go of Jada's hand and leaned forward, her eyes wide with sudden rising panic. My father stared at the glowing screen, unable to look away. Devin tapped the play button. The black and white security footage showed the bank lobby. A young woman wearing oversized designer sunglasses walked right up to the teller window. She slid a thick stack of papers across the marble counter. The camera angle shifted to a crystal-clear close-up from the teller station directly above her head. It was undeniably Jada. The camera captured her perfectly when she briefly lowered her sunglasses to speak to the bank employee. You could clearly see her face, her perfectly styled blonde hair, and the distinct custom gold necklace she always wore back in her 20s. You could watch her hand moving across the documents, physically forging my signature on the wire transfer authorizations. Devin reached into the folder Calvin was holding and pulled out a separate stack of paper. He handed those documents directly to my mother. "Those are the official Internet Protocol logs," Devin explained, outlining the evidence like a prosecutor closing a massive federal case. "They prove beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that the $80,000 wire transfer was initiated from the exact IP address assigned to Jada's personal cell phone. The cellular tower data places her physical location at a luxury nail salon in downtown Atlanta at the exact moment the money was drained from your account. The transfer was not initiated from Naomi Medical School apartment. Your younger daughter stole your life savings and framed her sister to cover her tracks." My father's face turned the sickly color of ash. He looked at the paperwork in his hands and then he looked back at the glowing screen. He was watching his precious golden child commit the exact federal crime she had successfully pinned on me. The heavy, undeniable weight of reality was crashing down on him. Brenda's hands were shaking so violently, she dropped the Internet Protocol logs directly onto the linoleum floor. The papers scattered around her expensive shoes. They had disowned me without a single second thought. They had missed my graduation. They had missed my wedding. They had lived in poverty and stress for 7 years, all because they actively chose to believe Jada lies over my truth. The absolute proof was staring them right in the face, and it was completely destroying their entire world. Jada began to panic. Her heart rate monitor started beeping rapidly as her chest heaved. She started shaking her head frantically side to side. "That is not me!" Jada cried out, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the iPad screen. "It is a fake video. Naomi paid someone to make that video. It is a deep fake. She is just trying to frame me today so she does not have to pay the hospital bill. Do not believe them, Mom." My father slowly looked away from the screen and stared at Jada. For the absolute first time in his entire life, he did not immediately believe her desperate lies. He looked at the date and timestamp burned into the corner of the security video. He looked at the digital Internet Protocol logs scattered on the floor. The evidence was absolute and entirely bulletproof. Even a man blinded by favoritism could not deny what was right in front of him. Jada realized she was rapidly losing control of the narrative. Her parents were not rushing to comfort her. She looked frantically across the room at Trey, begging for his support. "Trey, tell them," Jada pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. "Tell them Naomi is making this all up to ruin our lives." But Trey was not looking at Jada. He was not rushing to the bedside to defend his wife against these massive allegations. He was slowly taking small, quiet steps backward toward the open door. He wanted to slip out into the busy hospital hallway and completely disappear before the blast radius of this explosion reached him. He knew exactly what was coming next, and he wanted to be miles away when it happened. I stepped directly into his path, completely blocking his exit. "Where exactly do you think you are going, Trey?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. "You cannot leave us yet. We have not even discussed our special financial arrangement." Trey's face went completely white, draining of all remaining color. He held his hands up defensively, his palms sweating. "I do not know what you are talking about, Naomi," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the hallway behind me. "I have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I am just as shocked by this video as your parents are. I am a victim here too. I smiled. It was a cold, deeply calculating smile that promised absolute ruin for the man standing in front of me. Is that right? I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. Because that is certainly not the story you told me in the private consultation room yesterday afternoon. I slowly raised my left wrist and tapped the digital crown of my Apple Watch. I swiped the screen and pressed the bright green play button on the audio file I had secretly recorded. I had the speaker volume turned all the way up to maximum capacity. The pristine digital recording immediately filled the quiet hospital recovery suite. I have known the truth for 7 years, the recorded voice of Trey admitted, echoing loudly off the sterile walls. Jada got drunk on our honeymoon in Cabo and bragged about framing Naomi. She told me exactly how she did it. She laughed about it. My parents let out a simultaneous gasp of horror. Jada jaw dropped completely open, her pale, bruised face twisting into an expression of pure terror. But the digital recording was not finished destroying them. The audio continued playing Trey's desperate, selfish extortion attempt for the entire room to hear. If you sign those papers, the debt bypasses me completely. The recording played on, capturing every single greedy word. I file for divorce on Friday. I walk away completely clean and my credit score remains untouched. We both win, Naomi. Jada gets exactly what she deserves for bleeding me dry all these years. I tapped my watch, stopping the audio playback. The absolute silence that followed was completely deafening. It was the sound of an entire fake wealthy life collapsing into permanent dust. The perfect marriage they had bragged about for 7 years was completely exposed as a toxic, parasitic sham. Jada let out a sound that was half scream and half broken sob. "You absolute bastard!" she shrieked, grabbing her plastic cup of water from the tray table and throwing it directly at Trey. The cup bounced off his chest, splashing cold water all over his custom-tailored suit jacket. "You were going to abandon me. You were going to leave me trapped with $250,000 medical debt and run away to save your precious cars." Trey completely snapped under the immense, suffocating pressure of the trap. The recording had stripped away every single layer of his fake charm. He stopped pretending to be the innocent, terrified victim and turned on Jada with vicious, undeniable aggression. "Why the hell should I stay with you?" Trey yelled back at her, aggressively wiping the spilled water from his expensive lapel. "You are a complete financial liability. You spent every single dime of my money. You completely ruined my commercial credit score with your luxury shopping addiction. You are a sociopathic liar who stole from your own father just to buy a wedding dress and a beach vacation. I am not going down with your sinking ship, Jada. I am filing those divorce papers today and I am legally taking the house." He threw her completely under the bus to save himself, showing my devastated parents exactly what kind of ruthless, cowardly man they had chosen to replace me with. They stood there watching their beautiful golden child and their perfect, wealthy son-in-law completely tear each other to shreds over money and lies. The entire toxic foundation of their family was finally crumbling to the ground right in front of their eyes. Trey did not hesitate for another second. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase from the floor, completely ignoring the Louis Vuitton duffel bags he had carefully packed just an hour earlier. He did not look back at the hospital bed. He did not look at my parents. He just locked his eyes onto the open doorway and bolted. The sharp, frantic clicking of his designer shoes echoed loudly down the sterile hospital corridor as he practically ran toward the elevators. He was abandoning his marriage, his wife, and the massive financial crater they had dug together, all in a desperate, cowardly bid to save his commercial credit score. Jada let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute panic. "Trey, come back here!" she shrieked, her voice cracking painfully against her freshly sutured chest. "You cannot leave me here with this. You cannot do this to me." But the hallway remained completely empty. Trey was gone, and he was never coming back. Susan, the hospital billing administrator, cleared her throat, stepping slightly forward from her position by the door. Her expression remained perfectly professional, but her voice carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a financial executioner. With the sudden departure of your husband and his stated intent to file for immediate divorce, the financial guarantor responsibility falls entirely back onto the patient, Susan explained, looking directly at Jada. Unless your parents are willing to sign the assumption of liability forms today, the $250,000 balance will be sent directly to aggressive medical collections under your name by the end of the business week. Jada stared at Susan, her chest heaving as the reality of her total destruction finally settled in. She was completely broke. She was about to be divorced. And she was now legally shackled to $250,000 in medical debt that would inevitably force her into a brutal bankruptcy. Her luxurious fake lifestyle was officially dead. She whipped her head around and looked at my parents. Her eyes were wide and frantic, completely stripped of their usual arrogant confidence. "Mom, Dad," she cried out, reaching her trembling hands toward them. "You have to help me. You have to pay this bill. Naomi orchestrated this entire thing to ruin my marriage. She manipulated Trey. You cannot let her do this to me." But for the very first time in 33 years, the golden child, desperate tears had absolutely no effect. My mother, Brenda, did not rush to the bedside to stroke her hair. She did not wrap her arms around Jada and tell her everything was going to be perfectly fine. Instead, Brenda slowly backed away from the hospital bed, as if Jada had suddenly contracted a highly contagious disease. Brenda looked down at the internet protocol logs, still scattered across the linoleum floor. Then she looked up at the designer luggage stacked by the door, and finally at the expensive cashmere lounge set Jada was wearing. "You stole our retirement," Brenda whispered, her voice completely hollow, devoid of any warmth or maternal affection. "You stole your father's life savings. You let us lose sleep for 7 years, terrified of losing our house while you were drinking champagne on a beach in Mexico." "Mom, please." Jada begged, fresh tears streaming down her pale face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. "I made a mistake. I was young. I panicked. But you are my mother. You have to protect me." "Protect you, my father." Calvin interrupted, his voice cracking with a profound, heavy grief that seemed to age him 10 years in a matter of seconds. "We did protect you, Jada. We protected you by throwing your sister out onto the street. We protected you by cutting off our own flesh and blood, because you looked us dead in the eye and swore she was a criminal." Calvin's legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into the stiff plastic visitor chair, burying his face in his large, calloused hands. The imposing, terrifying patriarch who used to control our entire household with an iron fist was completely gone. In his place sat a broken, devastated old man who had just realized the absolute colossal magnitude of his own failure. He had spent decades working grueling double shifts, sacrificing his body and his time to build a comfortable nest egg for his family. In a single afternoon, his youngest daughter had stolen it all to pay for a party. And instead of investigating the truth, he had blindly pointed his rage at the one daughter who had actually earned her success through relentless hard work. He had missed my medical school graduation. He had missed my surgical residency matching ceremony. He had missed the day I married an incredible man who stood beside me with unwavering loyalty. He had traded a lifetime of genuine pride and love for a shallow lying thief who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient bank account. Jada continued to sob hysterically, begging them to sign the financial forms, begging them not to abandon her. But the family unit had completely imploded. The toxic foundation of lies, favoritism, and manipulation that had held them together for so long was entirely shattered into dust. Devin stood quietly by my side, a silent, imposing guardian. He reached over and gently closed the cover of the iPad, shutting off the paused image of Jada committing federal fraud at the bank teller window. The absolute precision of his legal strike had left 0 casualties on our side and completely decimated the enemy camp. I looked at the three of them, soaking in the miserable, pathetic reality they had actively chosen. I did not feel any sudden urge to comfort them. I did not feel any lingering filial duty to fix their broken hearts. The clinical detachment that made me an elite cardiothoracic surgeon served me perfectly in this exact moment. I had operated on the tumor. The infected tissue was fully excised. Now it was simply time to walk out of the operating room. I turned to Susan, the billing administrator, and gave her a polite nod. "Thank you for your time this morning, Susan," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "As you can clearly see, I will not be signing any financial guarantor forms today or ever. You may proceed with standard collection protocols against the patient." Susan nodded respectfully, tapping a final note into her electronic tablet. "Understood, Dr. Hayes," she replied before stepping out of the room and closing the heavy wooden door behind her, leaving us alone for the final confrontation. I turned to Devon and signaled that we were finished. He picked up his black leather briefcase, the latches clicking sharply in the quiet room. "Wait." The single desperate word came from my father. Calvin slowly raised his head from his hands. His face was stained with tears, and his eyes were red and swollen. He looked at me with an expression of such profound regret and desperation that it almost looked painful. He slowly pushed himself up from the plastic chair and took a shaky, hesitant step toward me. He looked at my crisp white medical coat. He looked at the executive identification badge clipped to my lapel. He finally saw the brilliant, successful woman I had become entirely without his help. He realized that I was the only person in this room who had ever told him the truth. I was the only one who had ever truly loved him without a hidden agenda. And he had thrown me away like garbage. "Naomi." Calvin choked out, his voice trembling violently, as fresh tears spilled down his weathered cheeks. "Naomi, my baby, we are so sorry." He reached a shaking hand out toward me, desperately wanting to bridge the massive 7-year canyon he had carved between us. "Please," Calvin begged, his voice dropping into a pathetic, broken plea. "We can fix this. We were completely wrong. We will make her pay for what she did to you. Just please do not walk out that door. You are our daughter. Help us." I looked down at my father, trembling hands suspended in the space between us. 7 years ago, I would have given absolutely anything for him to reach out to me like that. I would have traded my own soul just to hear him say he was sorry, and that he finally believed me. I used to lie awake in my tiny medical school apartment, staring at the ceiling and praying for the day my parents would realize they had made a terrible mistake. But looking at him now, seeing the absolute devastation pouring out of his red, swollen eyes, I felt completely hollow. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no lingering resentment. There was only a profound clinical indifference. I did not reach out to take his hand. I kept my arms resting casually at my sides, maintaining the exact same professional distance I would use with any random stranger in this hospital. "You are not sorry that you threw me away, Calvin," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotional weight. "You are just sorry that you bet your entire life on the wrong daughter. You are sorry that your perfect golden child is a fraud and your wealthy son-in-law is a coward. You are not reaching out to me right now because you suddenly love me or because you feel genuine remorse for the 7 years of hell you put me through. You are reaching out to me because I am the only person left in this room who actually has any power, and you are absolutely terrified of the financial nightmare you are facing." My father flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. His outstretched hand slowly dropped to his side, and he looked down at the linoleum floor, completely unable to meet my eyes. The brutal, undeniable truth of my words completely stripped away whatever tiny sliver of hope he had left. My mother let out a small, pathetic sob, covering her mouth with both of her hands. "Naomi, please," she whimpered, stepping toward me with a look of pure, desperate agony. "We are your parents. We gave you life. You cannot just leave us like this to deal with all of this alone. We can go to the police together. We can make Jada and Trey pay back every single penny. We can be a real family again." I turned my gaze to Brenda. I looked at the woman who had slapped me across the face and called me a jealous, bitter liar. You stopped being my parents the day you decided my sister's lies were more valuable than my truth. I replied, my words slicing through her desperate pleas with surgical precision. You made your choice 7 years ago. You sent those dramatic emails to our entire extended family, branding me a criminal. You changed the locks on your doors. You actively chose to miss my medical school graduation. You missed my surgical residency matching ceremony. You missed my wedding day. You built this exact toxic reality with your own 2 hands, and now you are going to have to live in it. I looked past my completely broken parents to the hospital bed. Jada was sitting perfectly still, her face completely blank with absolute shock. The monitor tracking her heart rate was beeping in a steady, rhythmic pattern. Her physical heart was fully repaired and beating strongly inside her chest, but everything else in her life was completely shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. She had absolutely no husband, no money, no designer clothes, and no future. She was going to spend the next decade of her life drowning in $250,000 of medical debt while dealing with the bitter, furious resentment of the parents she had robbed blind. I locked eyes with the sister who had ruined my life to pay for a beach vacation. "I saved your life, Jada," I said, looking directly into her pale, terrified eyes. "I saved you because I took a sacred oath as a doctor, and I do my job perfectly. But as a daughter and as a sister, I died to you 7 years ago. Do not ever contact me again." I turned away from them. I did not wait for another empty apology. I did not wait for my mother to cry louder, or for my father to drop to his knees and beg. I gave a single slight nod to Devon, and together we walked out of Private Recovery Suite 4. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, instantly cutting off the sounds of my mother sobbing and Jada panicking. We walked side by side down the long, brightly lit hospital corridor. The chaotic noise of the surgical intensive care unit faded away into the background. Nurses and medical technicians passed by nodding respectfully to me, but I barely registered their presence. My entire focus was on the incredible, overwhelming sensation of absolute freedom blooming in my chest. We stepped into the executive elevator, and the metal doors slid shut, isolating us in a quiet steel box. Devon reached out and gently took my hand. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. He looked down at me, his brown eyes filled with deep, profound pride. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. I looked at the digital numbers lighting up as we descended toward the ground floor. I realized that for the first time in 35 years, I was not carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of my family expectations. I was no longer the family scapegoat fighting desperately for a single scrap of validation. I had completely excised the toxic tumor from my life. "I am better than okay," I replied, squeezing his hand tightly. "I am finally completely free." The elevator doors opened into the main hospital lobby. We walked across the polished marble floors and pushed through the automatic sliding glass doors. The bright midday Atlanta sun immediately washed over us. The warm air smelled like pine trees and fresh pavement, completely devoid of the sterile chemical scent of the hospital. I took a deep, massive breath, letting the clean air fill my lungs completely. I left them up there in that hospital room with their massive debt, their exposed lies, and their ruined relationships. They were completely stuck with each other, bound together by their own greed and deceit. They would spend the rest of their lives fighting over the ashes of the fake empire they had tried to build. And I was going home to my beautiful, peaceful estate, my incredibly successful career, and the man who loved me with absolute, unwavering loyalty. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not anger. It is not screaming at the people who hurt you or spending your energy trying to destroy their lives. Sometimes the absolute greatest revenge is simply walking away and letting toxic people drown in the miserable reality they created for themselves. Have you ever had to walk away from your own flesh and blood to protect your peace? Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand and refuse to let manipulative family members drag you down into their chaos? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I know how incredibly hard it is to take that first step toward freedom. If my journey resonated with you, Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming toxic environments and building the life you actually deserve. And please remember, your worth is never determined by people who are actively committed to misunderstanding you. Keep walking forward. Keep protecting your peace, and never let anyone make you feel guilty for saving yourself.